Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. Daniel Paul Schreber. Introduction by Rosemary Dinage. Memoirs of My Nervous Illness must be the most written about document in all psychiatric literature. Over the years, a huge bibliography of books and articles chiefly in German and in English has accrued. Successive generations of psychiatric writers have used the book as the nub of successive theories. From the time that Freud's Seelbracht paper about it was published in 1911, everyone has had something to say about Schreber. Schreber himself believed his hook to have a message for the world, not only to expose the nature of the illness he had suffered but, more importantly for him, to pass on some kind of cloudy divine revelation. For the writing comes straight from the borderline between sanity and madness. Based on jottings made at the peak of his illness, the book was put together when he was approaching recovery with some of the resources of his fine mind once again available. He wanted it to become known, and so it has, because in its vividness and abundant detail it touches on so many of our assumptions about reality, about the structure of our perceived world, its space and time and objective identity. Schreber in his suffering and insanity saw all these dissolve away, and reform into the stuff of myth and nightmare. The memoirs were recognized as remarkable from their publication in 1903, medical reviewers recommended colleagues to read them. Nevertheless, if Freud had not been so intrigued by them, Schreber's story might by now be forgotten. Both Freud and Jung were fascinated by the book, and already in 1910 Freud was writing jokingly to Jung that the wonderful Schreber ought to have been made a professor of psychiatry and director of an asylum. It was Jung, always particularly interested in psychosis, who had first drawn his colleagues' attention to it, and the two men would borrow Schreberisms such as, I have only to add that in the above description I have anticipated somewhat in time for the sake of coherence. In actual fact, the development described belongs in part to a much later period. For instance, there was no question of playing the piano, which I mentioned above, for almost a year after my arrival at Sonnenstein. During the first weeks of my stay at Sonnenstein, in July or August 1894, I am convinced certain important changes took place with the son. As before, when discussing supernatural matters, I have to confine myself to relating impressions which I received and can only conjecture in how far these changes were objective events. I recollect that for a longish period there appeared to be a smaller sun. This sun, as mentioned at the end of chapter 8, was first led by Flechsig's soul but later by a soul whose nerves I identified as those of the director of the present asylum, Dr. Weber. While writing these lines I am fully aware that other people can only think this is sheer nonsense, as Dr. Weber is still among the living, a fact I myself have occasion to verify daily. Yet the impressions I received seemed to me so certain that I must assume that some time in the past Dr. Weber departed from this life and ascended with his nerves to blessedness, but then returned to life among mankind. This notion may be unfathomable for human beings and a possibility only to be explained in a natural manner. 6 Ja After the power of its rays had been exhausted, this smaller sun was then probably replaced by another sun. For several days and nights I had at that time the most wonderful and magnificent impressions, as already mentioned in footnote 11, chapter I. In my opinion, this was the time when the anterior realms of God had been exhausted and the posterior realms of God appeared on the scene for the first time. I believe I may say that at that time and at that time only, I saw God's omnipotence in its complete purity. During the night, and as far as I can remember in one single night, the lower God, Ahriman, appeared. The radiant picture of his rays became visible to my inner eye, compare footnote 6.1, while I was lying in bed not sleeping but awake, that is to say he was reflected on my inner nervous system. Simultaneously I heard his voice, but it was not a soft whisper as the talk of the voices always was before and after that time. It resounded in a mighty bass as if directly in front of my bedroom windows. The impression was intense, so that anybody not hardened to terrifying miraculous impressions as I was, would have been shaken to the core. Also what was spoken did not sound friendly by any means, everything seemed calculated to instill fright and terror into me, and the word wretch was frequently heard, an expression quite common in the basic language to denote a human being destined to be destroyed by God and to feel God's power and wrath. Yet everything that was spoken was genuine, not phrases learnt by rote as they later were, but the immediate expression of true feeling. For this reason my impression was not one of alarm and fear, but largely one of admiration for the magnificent and the sublime. The effect on my nerves was therefore beneficial despite the insults contained in some of the words, when the tested souls which had for a time kept shyly in the background dared to appear again. I could not but express my feelings repeatedly in words such as "Oh how pure!" towards the majesty of the divine rays, and "Oh how vulgar!" towards the tested souls. Further, the divine rays read my thoughts correctly, without falsifying them, as has been done without exception since, they even gave them verbal expression in a rhythm corresponding to the natural movement of human nerves, so that despite all the frightening side effects, the total impression I received was a calming one, and eventually I fell asleep. On the following day, and perhaps on one or two more days, in fact in daytime while I was in the garden, I saw the upper god I ormazed, this time not with my mind's eye but with my bodily eye. It was the sun, although not the sun in her usual appearance as known to every human being, but surrounded by a silver sea of rays which covered a sixth or eighth part of the sky, as mentioned in footnote 19, chapter 2. Figures of course do not matter very much, but to guard against any danger of exaggeration I concede that from my recollection it might as well have been only a tenth or the 12th part of the sky. However that may be, the sight was of such overwhelming splendor and magnificence that I did not dare look at it continually, but tried to avert my gaze from the phenomenon. One of the many things incomprehensible to me is that other human beings should have existed at that time apart from myself, and that the attendant M, who alone accompanied me at the time, remained apparently totally indifferent to this phenomenon. But his indifference did not really astonish me, because I considered him a fleeting improvised man, who of course led a dream life and so could not be expected to have any understanding for those impressions which must inspire a thinking human being with the highest interest. But I am absolutely at a loss to make sense of the fact that such a phenomenal impression should have passed him by if he was a real human being, and the many thousands of other people in other places who must have had the same impression at the time. Of course other people will be ready to counter with the slogan that I suffered from a mere hallucination. But the certainty of my recollection makes this for me subjectively quite out of the question, the more so as the phenomenon was repeated on several consecutive days and lasted for several hours on each single day, nor do I believe that my memory fails me when I add that that more radiant sun spoke to me in the same way as the sun did before and still does without interruption. After a few days the miraculous phenomena of which I have spoken were over, the sun assumed the shape which she has since then retained without interruption, the talk of the voices also turned again into a low whisper. I believe the reason for this change lies in the fact that at that time even God's omnipotence was induced to follow the example of Fichsig's soul and attempted tying to celestial bodies. If the influx of God's pure rays had lasted unhindered, as in the days described above and the nights following, I am certain that in a short time my recovery would have had to follow, or perhaps even that I would have been unmanned and simultaneously impregnate. But as one wanted neither the one nor the other, but always started from the mistaken notion that it would soon be possible to free oneself from the power of attraction of my nerves by forsaking me, tying to celestial bodies was started to prevent pure rays reaching my body. How little this policy was permanently successful will be shown later. My outward life was extremely monotonous during that time, the first months of my stay at Sonnenstein. Apart from daily morning and afternoon walks in the garden, I mainly sat motionless the whole day on a chair at my table, did not even move towards the window, where by the way nothing was to be seen except green trees, compare above. Even in the garden I preferred to remain seated always in the same spot, and was only occasionally urged by the attendants to walk about, really against my will. Naturally opportunities for occupation were almost completely lacking even had I had the inclination. During that period everything was kept locked in both my rooms and the keys removed, I had access only to one single drawer containing a few brushes and similar things. I did not possess writing material. All my necessaries, articles of clothing, watch, purse, knife, scissors, etc., were taken from me. There were only about 4 to 5 books in my room which I might have read had I been so inclined. All the same, the main reason for my immobility was not so much the actual lack of means of occupation but that I considered absolute passivity almost a religious duty. Although this idea did not originate spontaneously in me but was induced by the voices that talked to me, I kept it up myself for a time until I realized that it was purposeless. That rays could ever expect me to remain totally immobile, not the slightest movement was an often repeated slogan, must again be connected, I am convinced, with God not knowing how to treat a living human being, as he was accustomed to dealing only with corpses or at best with human beings lying asleep, dreaming. Thus arose the almost monstrous demand that I should behave continually as if I myself were a corpse, as also a number of other more or less absurd ideas, which were all contrary to human nature. Every noise created by miracle around me, and this recurs continually at short intervals, either by somebody speaking or making himself otherwise conspicuous, by cracking of walls, creaking of floors, etc., is in a peculiar confusion of terms called an interference, annoying to me. One falsely produces in me the phrase, if only the cursed interference would stop, which is reiterated innumerable times every day, by producing vibrations in my nerves which correspond to these words, whereas in reality these noises are felt as frightening by the rays, since they produce the so-called listening in thought. Further, in conditions in consonance with the order of the world, it would never occur to a human being to consider the talk of his fellow men, for instance, as an unpleasant interference. I believe I can explain how the wholly absurd notion arose by recalling the usual phenomena which accompany nerve contact made with a sleeping human being, in his dreams. Through such nerve contact a temporary connection was effected between divine rays and the nerves of that person. Of course it was calculated to last only a short time, perhaps for the purpose of imparting information about matters concerning the beyond, compare chapter 1, or to stimulate poetic imagination, etc. To succumb permanently to the power of attraction of such nerves would endanger God himself, therefore one had to attempt to get away again when the purpose was achieved. One only had to produce little noises by miracle, the so-called interferences, through which the attention of the sleeping, perhaps just waking, human being was diverted, and this short period of diverted attention sufficed the rays in the case of nerves not as highly excited as mine, to give up the nerve contact and enable them to withdraw from the person. No really serious danger could arise for God, while it was easy for rays to withdraw, as from only moderately excited nerves. These circumstances were then taken as pertaining equally to me, without making allowance that my relation to divine rays had long ago become indissoluble owing to the enormously increased power of attraction of my nerves. I considered the immobility demanded from me a duty incumbent on me both in the interests of self-preservation and of God, so as to liberate him from the embarrassment in which he found himself owing to the tested souls. I had formed the opinion, probably not altogether unfounded, that more rays would be lost if I myself moved to and fro, equally when a draught went through the room, as I was then still filled with holy awe towards divine rays because of their high purposes, and being also uncertain as to whether eternity really existed or whether the store of rays might suddenly be exhausted. I considered it my task to prevent any squandering of rays as far as it was in my power. I had also formed the view, influenced by the opinions of the voices continually talking to me in this sense, that a drawing down of tested souls, so that they should spend themselves totally in my body and thus allow the restoration of God's soul power in the sky, would be much facilitated if I kept my body immobile. I therefore made the almost incredible sacrifice of desisting from every movement and of course from every occupation for several weeks and months, the conversation of voices excepted. This went so far that not even at night did I dare change my position in bed, because the spending of tested souls was to be expected mostly during sleep. I made this sacrifice, although I had already then received some taste of the half and half policy which God's omnipotence pursued towards me, but I could not get myself to believe that God harbored really evil intent towards me. No change in these conditions occurred until the end of 1894 or early 1895. It coincided with another miraculous phenomenon, the cursed creation of a false feeling. This was the name given to it by the voices who recognized the tort intended by it. The constant endeavor of rays to withdraw from me, to forsake me, was checked only by the holiness of my purpose, which was bound to attract all pure souls or rays, and by my deep and sincere concern about my relation to God and my own situation in life. One started therefore to falsify my own frame of mind through miracles, in order to create the impression of a frivolous human being given only to the pleasures of the moment, to represent me as such, compare footnote 62. Such an influence by miracles on one's mood is possible, as I have learned by experience, but I am unable to say more as to how it comes about. In order to give the reader an approximate idea, I can only use a comparison, and point to the use of morphine, which has the effect of producing a relatively serene, in any case indifferent mood, in a person who is harassed by bodily pain or in the throes of a depression. At the beginning I resisted the influence of the creation of a false feeling, the mood-falsifying miracle, but as time went by I found it easier to allow its influence, because I noticed that subjectively I really felt less unhappy, and because I had to admit, that with all holiness of mind and with all my self-sacrificing endeavors to assist God in his fight against the tested souls, I had not really achieved very much. I became more indifferent to my own situation, remembered Horace's Carpe Diem, attempted to brush aside cares for the future, simply to live for the day and accept what life still had to offer. For instance, this led me to resume smoking cigars at the turn of 1894 to 95, which I had totally given up for years. On the other hand, the rays did not achieve their purpose with the creation of a false feeling. The power of attraction of my overexcited nerves remained undiminished in spite of the changed mood, the only difference being that I did not feel as unhappy as before. Here also, as in almost all miracles which are contrary to the order of the world, it seems the poet's word of the power which always wills the evil and yet creates the good applies. It goes almost without saying that my behavior as described above could not be correctly judged by my environment, least of all by my physicians and attendants, assuming always that they were then real human beings. As I had shown no interest in anything nor displayed any intellectual needs, they could hardly see in me anything but a stuporose dullard. And yet the real situation towered sky high above this appearance. I lived in the belief, and it is still my conviction, that this is the truth, that I had to solve one of the most intricate problems ever set for man, and that I had to fight a sacred battle for the greatest good of mankind. Unfortunately, my deceiving appearance to the contrary brought with it innumerable indignities in the way I was treated. For years I suffered from them severely, and it seemed that one had altogether forgotten my standing and the high official position I had occupied in life. The attendant repeatedly threw me back into the bath when I wanted to leave it after a time, or in the morning when it was time to get up and I wanted to, threw me back into bed for reasons unknown to me, or in daytime when I was about to doze sitting at the table, he wakened me out of my sleep by pulling my beard, or he combed my hair with a fine comb while I was in the bath, and this at a time when flights of rays plowed through my skull. Compare the next chapter. At meal times he used to tie a napkin round my neck as if I were a little child. Cigars were given me one at a time at certain hours of the day. Only several years afterwards did I succeed in obtaining all the cigars for the day in the morning. Later still a box of 100 was put at my disposal as reserve. From another attendant I once had to suffer the indignity of having my ears boxed. Sometimes I opposed such indignities with actual resistance, particularly when one wanted to remove the wash basin for the night from my bedroom, which was locked from the outside, or when one tried to move me from my own bedroom to sleep in the cells fitted out for raving madmen. Later on I desisted from all opposition because it led to senseless scenes of violence. I kept silent and suffered. Naturally nothing is further from my mind than to wish to denounce the attendant or any other attendant to his superiors by relating the indignities I had to suffer. I condone the excesses which was guilty of in view of his low education. It is also true that in later years he served me satisfactorily on the whole, although he continued to give himself airs. But I could not avoid mentioning these little traits if I wanted to demonstrate the measure of ignominy which I had to endure for years and the deep wounding of my sense of honor which at all times was fully alive. In order to complete the picture of my situation during the early part of my stay at Sonnenstein, it is necessary to give an account of the miracles which were enacted against me, and I will do this in the following chapter. From the first beginnings of my contact with God up to the present day, my body has continuously been the object of divine miracles. If I wanted to describe all these miracles in detail, I could fill a whole book with them alone. I may say that hardly a single limb or organ in my body escaped being temporarily damaged by miracles, nor a single muscle being pulled by miracles, either moving or paralyzing it according to the respective purpose. Even now the miracles which I experience hourly are still of a nature as to frighten every other human being to death. Only by getting used to them through the years have I been able to disregard most of what happens as trivialities. But in the first year of my stay at Sonnenstein the miracles were of such a threatening nature that I thought I had to fear almost incessantly for my life, my health, or my reason. In itself a state of affairs must be considered contrary to the order of the world, in which the rays serve mainly to inflict damage on the body of a single human being or to play tricks with the objects with which he is occupied. Such harmless miracles have become particularly frequent latterly. For rays have the task of creating, not just of destroying or playing childish pranks. Hence all miracles directed against me fail in the long run in their purpose. What has been destroyed or damaged by impure rays must always later be built up or mended again by pure rays, compare above chapter 7, footnote 48. But this does not exclude that temporarily most serious damage is caused and very painful conditions arise, giving the impression of extreme danger. Most nearly in consonance with the order of the world were those miracles which were somehow connected with the process of unmanning to be carried out on my body. To them belonged especially the various changes in my sex organ. Several times, particularly in bed, there were marked indications of an actual retraction of the male organ, frequently however, particularly when mainly impure rays were involved, of a softening approaching almost complete dissolution, further the removal by miracles of single hairs from my beard and particularly my mustache, finally a change in my whole stature, diminution of body size, probably due to a contraction of the vertebrae and possibly of my thigh bones. The last mentioned miracle, which emanated from the lower god, Ahriman, was always accompanied by him with the announcement, "I wonder whether to make you somewhat smaller." I immediately had the impression that my body had become smaller by about 6 to 8 cms, that is to say approximating the size of the female body. The miracles enacted against the organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavities were very multifarious. I know least about those concerning the heart. I only remember that I once had a different heart still during my stay in the University Clinic of Leipzig. On the other hand, my lungs were for a long time the object of violent and very threatening attacks. By nature my lungs and chest are very healthy, but my lungs were so affected by miracles that for a time I seriously believed I had to fear a fatal outcome in consequence of pulmonary phthisis. A lungworm was frequently produced in me by miracles. I cannot say whether it was an animal-like being or a soul-like creature. I can only say that its appearance was connected with a biting pain in the lungs similar to the pains I imagine occur in inflammation of the lungs. The lobes of my lungs were at times almost completely absorbed. I cannot say whether as the result of the activity of the lungworm alone or also because of miracles of a different kind. I had the definite feeling that my diaphragm was raised high in my chest to almost directly under my larynx, and that there remained only a small remnant of lung in between with which I could hardly breathe. There were days when during my walks in the garden I had to reconquer my lungs anew with every breath. For the part which is so miraculous is that the rays cannot but furnish a suffering body with whatever is most essential for its preservation, because to create is their essence and nature. At about the same time some of my ribs were sometimes temporarily smashed, always with the result that what had been destroyed was reformed after a time. One of the most horrifying miracles was the so-called compression of the chest miracle, which I endured at least several dozen times. It consisted in the whole chest wall being compressed, so that the state of oppression caused by the lack of breath was transmitted to my whole body. The compression of the chest miracle recurred several times in later years, but like the other miracles described here, it belongs mainly to the second half of the year 1894 and perhaps the first half of the year 1895. Concerning the stomach, already during my stay in Flechsig's asylum the Viennese nerve specialist named in chapter 5 miraculously produced in place of my healthy natural stomach a very inferior so-called fused stomach. Later for a time the miracles were in preference directed against my stomach, partly because the souls begrudged me the sensual pleasure connected with the taking of food, partly because they considered themselves superior to human beings who require earthly nourishments. They therefore tended to look down on all eating and drinking with some disdain. 69 I existed frequently without a stomach. I expressly told the attendant M, as he may remember, that I could not eat because I had no stomach. Sometimes immediately before meals a stomach was so to speak produced ad hoc by miracles. This was done particularly by von W.'s soul, which in at least some of its forms sometimes showed a friendly spirit towards me. Naturally this never lasted long. The stomach which had been produced by miracles, in any case only an inferior stomach, was usually removed again miraculously by VW's soul during the meal because of a change of mind. Great changeability is a marked feature of the soul character, absolutely divine rays perhaps excluded. Food and drink taken simply poured into the abdominal cavity and into the thighs, a process which, however unbelievable it may sound, was beyond all doubt for me as I distinctly remember the sensation. In the case of any other human being this would have resulted in natural pus formation with an inevitably fatal outcome, but the food pulp could not damage my body because all impure matter in it was soaked up again by the rays. Later, I therefore repeatedly went ahead with eating unperturbed, without having a stomach. All in all I gradually got used to regarding everything which happened in my body with complete equanimity. Even now I am convinced that I am immune to all natural disease influences. Disease germs only arise in me through rays and are removed again in the same way by rays. Indeed I doubt very much whether I am at all mortal as long as the communication with rays lasts. For instance, I think I could take the strongest poison without particular danger to my life and my health. After all, what can poisons do but destroy some important organs or have a destructive effect on the blood? Both have happened to me innumerable times through rays without any permanent ill effect. Of other internal organs I will only mention the gullet and the intestines, which were torn or vanished repeatedly, further the pharynx, which I partly ate up several times, finally the seminal cord, against which very painful miracles were directed, with the particular purpose of suppressing the sensation of voluptuousness arising in my body. I must further mention a miracle which affected my whole abdomen, the so-called putrefaction of the abdomen. This miracle originated regularly from von W.'s soul in one of its most impure shapes in contrast to other parts of von W.'s soul, hence the name abdominal putrefaction of von W. It threw the putrid matter which caused the abdominal putrefaction into my belly with such ruthlessness, that more than once I believed I would have to rot alive, and the rotten smell escaped from my mouth in a most disgusting manner. Von W.'s soul assumed that the abdominal putrefaction would be removed again by God's rays. This happened through rays of a particular kind adapted to this purpose, which pushed their way into my intestines like a wedge and absorbed their putrid content. God's rays appeared to act from the instinctive knowledge that it would be most distasteful for them to have to allow themselves to be attracted by a rotting body. This notion was expressed repeatedly in the slogan, that if I were to be forsaken, I should be forsaken with a pure body, but naturally this notion too suffered from the usual obscurity, as apparently one was not at all clear how the nerves of a forsaken body would lose their power of attraction. Those miracles always appeared most threatening to me which were in one way or another directed against my REA son. These concerned firstly my head, secondly during a certain period of probably several weeks round the autumn of 1894 also the spinal cord, which next to the head was considered as the seat of reason. One therefore attempted to pump the spinal cord out, which was done by so-called little men placed in my feet. Later I will have more to say about these little men, which have some similarity to the phenomenon of the same name which I discussed in chapter 6, as a rule there were two of them, a little Flechsig and a little von W., whose voices I could also hear in my feet. The effect of the pumping out was that the spinal cord left my mouth in considerable quantity in the form of little clouds, particularly when I was walking in the garden. One can imagine the apprehension with which such events filled me, as I did not then know whether or not any part of my reason would thus in fact vanish into the air. The miracles directed against my head and the nerves of my head happened in manifold ways. One attempted to pull the nerves out of my head, for a time even, during the nights, to transplant them into the head of M who slept in the next room. These attempts caused, besides the fear of an actual loss of my nerves, an unpleasant tension in my head. However, the pulling out succeeded only moderately, the staying power of my nerves proved the greater force and the half pulled out nerves always returned to my head after a short time. Serious devastation was caused in my head by the so-called flights of rays, a phenomenon difficult to describe, the effect of which was that my skull was repeatedly sawn asunder in various directions. I frequently had and still have regularly daily the sensation that my whole skull had temporarily thinned. In my opinion this was brought about through the bony material of my skull being partly pulverized by the destructive action of the rays, but it is restored again by pure rays particularly during sleep. One can form some picture of the disagreeable sensations these happenings cause if one considers that these are the rays of a whole world somehow mechanically fastened at their point of issue which travel around one single head and attempt to tear it asunder and pull it apart in a fashion comparable to quartering. Further, in the time I am discussing attempts were repeatedly made to cover my nerves with some noxious matter, it appeared as if the natural capacity of nerves to vibrate were thereby really impaired, so that even I myself had at times the impression of becoming temporarily stupid. One of the agents concerned was called poison of intoxication. I cannot say what its chemical nature was. From time to time also the liquids of the food I had taken were by miracle placed on the nerves of my head, so that these were covered with a sort of paste, and the capacity to think temporarily impaired. I remember distinctly that this happened once with coffee. All my muscles were, and still are, the object of miracles for the purpose of preventing all movements and every occupation I am about to undertake. For instance, attempts are made to paralyze my fingers when I play the piano or write, and to cause some damage to my kneecap to make marching impossible when I walk about in the garden or in the corridor. Lately the effect has mostly been only to make such occupations difficult or cause only moderate pain on walking. My eyes and the muscles of the lids which serve to open and close them were an almost uninterrupted target for miracles. The eyes were always of particular importance, because rays lose the destructive power with which they are equipped after a relatively short time as soon as they see something, and then enter my body without causing damage. The object seen can be either visual, impressions, which are communicate to the rays when my eyes are open, or images which I can cause at will on my inner nervous system by imagination, so that they become visible to the rays. I shall return to these events, which in the soul language are called the picturing of human beings, in another context. Here I will only mention that attempts were made early on and kept up throughout the past years, to close my eyes against my will, so as to rob me of visual impressions and thus preserve the rays' destructive power. This phenomenon can be observed on me at almost every moment. Whoever watches carefully will observe that my eyelids suddenly droop or close even while I am talking to other people. This never occurs in human beings under natural conditions. In order to keep my eyes open nevertheless, a great effort of will is needed, but as I am not always particularly interested in keeping my eyes open, I allow them to be closed temporarily at times. During my first months here the miracles on my eyes were performed by little men, very similar to those I mentioned when describing the miracle directed against my spinal cord. These little men were one of the most remarkable and even to me most mysterious phenomena, but I have no doubt whatever in the objective reality of these happenings, as I saw these little men innumerable times with my mind's eye and heard their voices. The remarkable thing about it was that souls or their single nerves could in certain conditions and for particular purposes assume the form of tiny human shapes, as mentioned earlier only of a few millimeters in size, and as such made mischief on all parts of my body, both inside and on the surface. Those occupied with the opening and closing of the eyes stood above the eyes in the eyebrows and there pulled the eyelids up or down as they pleased with fine filaments like cobwebs. Here too those concerned were usually a little Flechsig and a little VW. And sometimes in addition another little man, who had originated from Daniel Firchtegot Flechsig's soul which still existed at that time. Whenever I showed signs of being unwilling to allow my eyelids to be pulled up and down and actually opposed it, the little men became annoyed and expressed this by calling me wretch. If I wiped them off my eyes with a sponge, it was considered by the rays as a sort of crime against God's gift of miracles. By the way, wiping them away had only a very temporary effect, because the little men were each time set down afresh. Other little men were assembled almost continuously on my head in great number. They were called little devils. They literally walked around on my head, curiously nosing about to see whether any new destruction had been caused on my head by miracles. In a way they even partook of my meals, helping themselves to a part, though naturally only a tiny part, of the food I ate. It made them appear temporarily somewhat swollen, but also less active and less destructive in their intentions. Some of the little devils participate in a miracle which was often enacted against my head and of which I will now say a little more. This was perhaps the most abominable of all miracles next to the compression of the chest miracle. The expression used for it, if I remember correctly, was the head compressing machine. In consequence of the many flights of rays, etc., there had appeared in my skull a deep cleft or rent roughly along the middle, which probably was not visible from outside but was from inside. The little devils stood on both sides of this cleft and compressed my head as though in a vice by turning a kind of screw, causing my head temporarily to assume an elongated almost pear-shaped form. It had an extremely threatening effect, particularly as it was accompanied by severe pain. The screws were loosened temporarily but only very gradually, so that the compressed state usually continued for some time. The little devils responsibly mostly derived from VW's soul. These little men and little devils disappeared after a few months, never to appear again. The moment of their departure coincided approximately with the appearance of the posterior realms of God. It is true that miracles are still responsible for opening and closing my eyelids in the manner described, but for almost 6 years now it has no longer been done by the little men but directly by rays which set the muscles concerned in motion. In order to prevent my closing or opening my eyes at will, the thin layer of muscle situated in and above the eyelids and serving their movement has several times been removed by miracle. But again the effect was only temporary. The muscle tissue so lost was always restored again for reasons often mentioned before. Manifold miracles were also directed against my skeleton, apart from those against my ribs and skull mentioned earlier. In the foot bones, particularly in the region of the heel, caries was often caused by miracle, causing me considerable pain. Luckily, however, the severest pains did not last long. A similar miracle was the so-called coccyx miracle. This was an extremely painful, caries-like state of the lowest vertebrae. Its purpose was to make sitting and even lying down impossible. Altogether I was not allowed to remain for long in one and the same position or at the same occupation. When I was walking one attempted to force me to lie down, and when I was lying down one wanted to chase me off my bed. Rays did not seem to appreciate at all that a human being who actually exists must be somewhere. Because of the irresistible attraction of my nerves I had become an embarrassing human being for the rays, for God, in whatever position or circumstance I might be or whatever occupation I undertook. One did not want to admit that what had happened was not my fault, but one always tended to reverse the blame by way of representing. I believe I have given an almost complete description in this chapter of those miracles which I was led to consider the essential ones, because of their threatening character. In the course of this essay I will frequently have to mention many other miracles of a less dangerous kind, partly on my body, partly on the objects around me, Some of them had already appeared side by side with the miracles described above, some only started later. As mentioned in chapter 9, the talk of the voices had already become mostly an empty babble of ever-recurring monotonous phrases in tiresome repetition. On top of this, they were rendered grammatically incomplete by the omission of words and even syllables. However, the description of a certain number of phrases used is of interest, because of the sidelight thrown on the soul's whole way of thinking, their idea of human life and of human thinking. Among these phrases are those in which I was called a Prince of Hay-One roughly since the time of my stay in Pearson's asylum. It was said innumerable times, for instance, that God's omnipotence has decided that the Prince of Hell is going to be burned alive. The Prince of Hell is responsible for the loss of rays. We announce victory over the beaten Prince of Hell, but then again by some of the voices, not Schreber, but Flechsig is the true Prince of Hell, etc. Anybody who knew me in my former life and had the opportunity of observing my cool and sober nature, will readily believe that I myself could never have ventured on so fantastic a term as that of Prince of Hell, still less as it was in such queer contrast to the poverty of my outward life situation, to the many limitations of freedom to which I was subjected, etc. There was certainly nothing in the appearance of my surroundings which was remindful of either hell or of a princely setting. In my opinion, the expression Prince of Hell, which was only erroneously applied to me, was originally based on an abstraction. The realms of God may always have known that the order of the world, however great and magnificent, was yet not without its Achilles heel, inasmuch as the human nerve's power of attracting God's nerves constituted some danger for the realms of God. These dangers were likely to become more acute when somewhere on earth or on any other star nervousness or moral depravity gained the upper hand. In order to form a clearer picture of these dangers, the souls had apparently adopted a kind of personification, similar to the way in which nations in their infancy try to understand the idea of God better by means of graven images of false gods. The phrase Prince of Hell was probably meant to convey the uncanny power inimical to God that could develop from moral decay among mankind or a general spread of nervous overexcitement in consequence of over-civilization. As my nerves' power of attraction became more and more irresistible, the Prince of Hell appeared suddenly to have become reality in my person. An enemy was therefore seen in me who had to be destroyed by all the might of divine power. One refused to recognize that on the contrary I was the best friend to pure rays from whom alone I could expect my recovery or other satisfactory solution of the conflict. One was apparently more inclined to share one's own power with impure, tested souls, God's real enemies, than to put up with the idea of being dependent on a single human being whom one would otherwise have looked down upon in the proud awareness of distant power. Phrases of another group having certain factual significance were those in which one talked of the soul conception. Fundamentally, this contains significant and valuable ideas. In its original meaning, soul conception is, I think, a somewhat idealized version which souls had formed of human life and thought. One must remember that souls were the departed spirits of erstwhile human beings. As such, they had a lively interest not only in their own human past but also in the fortunes of their still living relatives and friends, and in everything that happened to mankind. They could gain such knowledge either through nerve contact or outward impressions by actually seeing. I compare chapter I. They were able to express in more or less distinct words some rules of conduct and attitude to life. I will quote a few of these sentences as examples. Do not think about certain parts of your body was a rule of conduct apparently expressing the idea that man in his normal healthy state has no reason to think of particular parts of his body, unless reminded of them by pain. Not at the first demand, was another phrase, indicating that a sensible human being would not allow himself to be led into one or other accession by a momentary impulse. A job started must be finished was the formula expressing that man should pursue to its ultimate goal what he starts, without being distracted by adverse influences, etc. In man's thought processes one distinguished the thought of decision, man's exertion of will to do a certain thing, wishful thoughts, thoughts of hope and thoughts of fear. The thinking it over thought denoted something perhaps also known to psychologists. It often leads a person to turn his willpower in the opposite direction, or at least change it from that which at first he may have felt inclined to follow, but which on further consideration automatically causes doubts. The human thought of recollection was used to indicate man's automatic need to imprint on his mind by repetition an important thought which had occurred to him. How deeply ingrained the human thought of recollection is in the nature of the human processes of thought and feeling, can be seen from very characteristic instances when in poems rhymes or refrains recur, or when in musical compositions a certain sequence of notes expressing the embodiment of beauty occurs not only once but is repeated again and again. A very prominent part was played in the soul conception by ideas about the relation between the two sexes and their respective mode of occupation, their tastes, etc. For instance, beds, hand mirrors and rakes were considered feminine, basket chairs and spades masculine, of games, chess as masculine, checkers as feminine, etc. Souls knew very well that a man lies on his side in bed, a woman on her back lost the succumbing part, considered from the point of view of sexual intercourse. I myself, who in earlier life never gave it a thought, have only learned this from the souls. From what I read in for instance my father's Medical Indoor Gymnastics 123rd edition, p. 102, physicians themselves do not seem to be informed about it. Further, the souls knew that male voluptuousness is stimulated by the sight of female nudes, but on the contrary female voluptuousness to a very much lesser extent if at all by the sight of male nudes, while female nudes stimulate both sexes equally. For instance, the sight of a nude male body perhaps at a swimming exhibition, will leave the female public cold. For this reason their admission is rightly not considered immoral to the same extent as the presence of men at a female swimming exhibition, whereas a ballet will produce some sexual stimulation in both sexes. I do not know whether these phenomena are generally known and considered correct. My own observations and the behavior of my own nerves of voluptuousness leave me in no doubt that the soul conception is correct in this respect. I am of course fully aware that the reaction of my own ephemerally nerves of voluptuousness does not in itself constitute proof for the very reason that it is exceptional for female nerves to be present in a male body as in my case. A distinction between masculine and feminine with respect to articles of clothing, the armamentarium as it was called in the basic language, is almost self-evident. Boots paired to the souls an especial symbol characteristic of manliness. To the souls to take off boots meant much the same as unmanning. These short remarks may suffice to give an approximate idea of the original meaning of the expression soul conception. What I know about it I owe partly to definite information during the early part of my illness and partly to impressions received in my contact with souls. I have thus gained insight into the nature of human thought processes and human feelings for which many a psychologist might envy me. The phrases about soul conception received a quite different meaning later. They degenerated into mere flourishes with which one tried to satisfy the need for speech, while totally lacking in own thoughts. Compare Chapter 9. Do not forget that you are bound to the soul conception, and now then, that is too much according to the soul conception, became constantly recurring empty phrases, by the endless repetition of which I was tortured for years almost beyond endurance and still am. The latter phrase especially was the soul's almost constant retort when they could not think of what to say further to a new thought of mine, and it also shows by its poor stylistic form the degeneracy which had set in. In contrast, the genuine basic language, that is the expression of the soul's true feelings before the time the mechanically repeated phrases commenced, excelled in form also by its dignity and simplicity. Certain other phrases with quite important meanings can only be mentioned in the next chapter because of their context. My outward living conditions have in some respects at least become more bearable since about the first half of the year 1895, as mentioned at the end of chapter 10. Most important was that I started to occupy myself in different ways. It is true I still decline to write to my relatives, in particular to my wife, although the attendant tried to persuade me. I did not then believe in the existence of a real mankind outside the asylum, but thought that all the human shapes I saw, in particular my wife when she visited me, were fleeting and improvised for only a limited time, so that to write letters as was suggested to me would have been a sheer farce in which I was not prepared to take part. Since then, however, there have been opportunities to play chess, with other patients or with attendants, and to play the piano. Having once or twice played the piano in the common room or library of the asylum during my wife's visits, a small piano was put into my room in the spring of 1895 for my regular use. The feelings aroused in me when I resumed this occupation, which in days of health I had enjoyed, I can best describe with a quotation from Tannhäuser. Total forgetting descended between today and yesterday. All my memories vanished rapidly, and I could only remember that I had lost all hope of ever greeting you again or ever raising my eyes to you. The only time I played the piano in Flechsig's asylum was on my wife's urgent persuasion. It was the aria from Handel's Messiah, I know that my Redeemer liveth, from a score which happened to be at hand. My state was such that I played in the certain conviction of it being the last time in my life that my fingers would touch the keys of a piano. Having resumed chess and piano playing in the asylum, they became my two main occupations during the whole 5 years which have since passed. Playing the piano in particular was and still is of immense value to me. I must confess that I find it difficult to imagine how I could have borne the compulsive thinking and all that goes with it during these 5 years had I not been able to play the piano. During piano playing, the nonsensical twaddle of the voices which talk to me is drowned. Next to physical exercises, it is one of the most efficient forms of the so-called not thinking of anything thought, but again one wanted to deprive me of it by introducing the musical not thinking of anything thought, as it was called in the soul language. The rays always at least have a visual impression from my hands and from my reading the score, and every attempt at representing me by the creation of a false feeling and such like is doomed to end in failure because of the real feeling one can put into piano playing. Piano playing therefore was and still is one of the main objects of curses. The difficulties which were put in my way defy description. My fingers are paralyzed, the direction of my gaze is changed in order to prevent my finding the correct keys, my fingers are diverted onto wrong keys, the tempo is quickened by making the muscles of my fingers move prematurely. All these were and still are daily occurrences. Even the piano itself was frequently the object of miracles, and strings were broken, luckily much more rarely in recent years. In 1897 alone the bill for broken piano strings amounted to no less than 86 marks. This is one of the few instances which I believe furnishes sufficient proof to convince other people of the reality of the miracles which I maintain happen. Superficial judgment might lead some to assume that I myself have caused the piano strings to snap by senseless banging on the piano. This was for instance my wife's repeatedly stated opinion, possibly having heard it from the physicians. In reply I maintain, and I am convinced that every expert will support me in this, that it is altogether impossible to snap the strings of a piano merely by banging on the keys, however violently. The small hammers linked with the keys only lightly touch the strings, and could never strike them sufficiently hard to break them. Let anyone try to hit the keys as hard as he likes, even with a hammer or a log of wood, the keyboard may perhaps be broken to pieces, but he will never be able to break a string. Strings have broken much less frequently in recent years. It still happens occasionally because the rays, God's, intent towards me has become less unfriendly. More about this later. Owing to my constantly increasing soul voluptuousness, the rays were also forced by still more unpleasant conditions, even for them, in particular by the so-called bellowing, to consider piano playing the most congenial pastime for all concerned. I must mention another miraculous event in this connection, although it really belongs to an earlier time, which is one of the most mysterious things even I ever experienced, who, after all, has seen so much of miraculous things. I remember that on a certain day while I still kept immobile, that is in the summer or autumn of 1894, the attempt was made on one occasion to place a whole grand piano, Bleithner, in my room by miracle. It seems to have been one of VW's miracles. I am fully aware how absurd this sounds, and I must therefore ask myself whether it could not have been a hallucination. But certain circumstances make it extremely difficult for me to think so. I remember clearly that it took place in broad daylight while I was sitting in a chair or on the sofa. In front of me I distinctly saw the polished brown surface of a grand piano in the making, hardly a few paces away. Unfortunately, I disregarded the miracle at the time. I wanted nothing whatever to do with any kind of miracle. They all filled me with disgust, particularly as I had made absolute passivity my duty. Later I sometimes regretted that I did not encourage the miracle, pacify. It was the expression in the basic language, to find out whether it could really be completed. Almost without exception all miracles were and are doomed to failure or rendered much more difficult if I oppose them resolutely with my will. And so I must leave undecided what objective background the reported event had. If it really was a hallucination, it must have been of a most extraordinary kind in view of the immediate proximity of the object supposedly seen. Miracles of heat and cold were and still are daily enacted against me during walks in the garden and when I am indoors, always with the purpose of preventing the natural feeling of bodily well-being which is caused by the soul voluptuousness. For instance, miracles make my feet cold and my face hot. I think the physiological mechanism is that during the cold miracle the blood is forced out of the extremities, so causing a subjective feeling of cold, and that conversely during the heat miracle the blood is forced towards my face and head, in which of course coolness is the condition corresponding to a general sense of well-being. From youth accustomed to enduring both heat and cold, these miracles troubled me little, except when miracles made my feet cold while lying in bed, as happened often. Conversely, I myself have often been forced to seek heat and cold. This was particularly necessary during the first years of my stay here, when soul voluptuousness had not yet reached its present degree, in order to divert the rays towards the chilly parts, particularly to the hands and feet, and so protect the head from the injurious influences intended. I frequently clung to the icy trees with my hands for many minutes during the winter, or held balls of snow until my hands were almost paralyzed. For some time, probably in the spring or autumn of 1895, I put my feet through the iron bars of the open window at night in order to expose them to the cold rain. As long as I did this the rays could not reach my head, which of course was of foremost importance to me, and I felt therefore perfectly well apart from frozen feet. 75 I have reason to assume that this behavior of mine somehow came to the notice of my physicians and caused them to adopt a measure which provoked my severest displeasure. For a few days I was moved from my usual rooms, and on my return I found that heavy wooden shutters had been fixed before my bedroom window, which were locked at night so that my bedroom was in total darkness and even the first light of day in the morning could hardly penetrate. Naturally the physicians probably had no idea of how deeply this measure affected me in my extremely hard struggle in defending myself against the attempts directed at destroying my reason. But it is understandable that it filled me with a deep and long-lasting sense of bitterness. Light, necessary for every human occupation, had become almost more essential for me than my daily bread in my allotted task of at all times convincing God, who does not know the living human being, of my undiminished powers of reason. Therefore depriving me of artificial light and prolonging the time of natural darkness made my position immeasurably more difficult. I will not dispute with the physicians whether the measure they imposed was necessary from a purely human point of view to protect my health from the consequences of harmful actions. But here too I cannot help remarking that the means did not seem to fit the end. What could possibly have happened to me other than contracting a cold? The iron bars gave sufficient protection against the danger of falling out of the window, and as regards the danger of contracting a cold, one might well have waited to see whether human beings' natural need for warmth would not have prevented me from keeping the windows open too long. But these neither were nor are the decisive factors. For me the main point was that I could only see the physicians as tools in whose nerves decisions were aroused by divine rays aimed at furthering the plans directed at destroying my reason, naturally without the physicians themselves becoming subjectively conscious of this but thinking that they were acting simply from human deliberations. I must still maintain this opinion because behind every word which the physicians and other people speak to me I notice the divine influence as revealed to me by the writing down material I know so well, which I will perhaps try to explain further later on. In writing these lines I do not mean to recriminate about the past. I harbor no ill will against any human being for what happened in times gone by, happily it has mostly been overcome. but I thought it necessary to discuss the affair about the window shutters in greater detail to explain the deep mistrust of the physicians which filled me for years, and of which they possibly noticed some signs in my behavior. These shutters, the only ones in the whole wing of the asylum I inhabited, still exist, but have not been closed for a long time. Usually such shutters are found only in the cells equipped for raving madmen on the ground floor and first floor of the round wing of the asylum. For 2 years, 1896 to 1898, I slept in several of these cells, as I will relate later, in which time the adverseness of my circumstances was if possible increased by the darkness. The month of November 1895 marks an important time in the history of my life, and in particular in my own ideas of the possible shaping of my future. I remember the period distinctly. It coincided with a number of beautiful autumn days when there was a heavy morning mist on the Elbe. During that time the signs of a transformation into a woman became so marked on my body, that I could no longer ignore the imminent goal at which the whole development was aiming. In the immediately preceding nights my male sexual organ might actually have been retracted had I not resolutely set my will against it, still following the stirring of my sense of manly honor, so near completion was the miracle. Soul voluptuousness had become so strong that I myself received the impression of a female body, first on my arms and hands, later on my legs, bosom, buttocks and other parts of my body. I will discuss details in the next chapter. Several days' observations of these events suffice to change the direction of my will completely. Until then I still considered it possible that, should my life not have fallen victim to one of the innumerable menacing miracles before, it would eventually be necessary for me to end it by suicide. Apart from suicide the only possibility appeared to be some other horrible end for me, of a kind unknown among human beings. But now I could see beyond doubt that the order of the world imperiously demanded my unmanning, whether I personally liked it or not, and that therefore it was common sense that nothing was left to me but reconcile myself to the thought of being transformed into a woman. Nothing of course could be envisaged as a further consequence of unmanning but fertilization by divine rays for the purpose of creating new human beings. My change of will was facilitated by my not believing at that time that apart from myself a real mankind existed. On the contrary, I thought all the human shapes I saw were only fleeting and improvised, so that there could be no question of any ignominy being attached to unmanning. It is true however that those rays which were intent on forsaking me and which for that purpose wanted to destroy my reason, did not fail to make a hypocritical appeal to my sense of manly honor. Some of the phrases, since repeated innumerable times whenever soul voluptuousness appeared, were, "Are you not ashamed in front of your wife?" or still more vulgarly, "Fancy a person who was a Senate's president allowing himself to be f.d." But however repellent these voices, however often I had occasion to air my just indignation in one way or another during the thousand-fold repetition of these phrases, I did not allow myself to be diverted from that behavior which I had come to recognize as essential and curative for all parties, myself and the rays. Since then I have wholeheartedly inscribed the cultivation of femininity on my banner, and I will continue to do so as far as consideration of my environment allows, whatever other people who are ignorant of the supernatural reasons may think of me. I would like to meet the man who, faced with the choice of either becoming a demented human being in male habitus, or a spirited woman, would not prefer the latter. Such and only such is the issue for me. The pursuit of my previous profession, which I loved wholeheartedly, every other aim of manly ambition, and every other use of my intellectual powers in the service of mankind, are now all closed to me through the way circumstances have developed. Even communication with my wife and relatives is denied me apart from occasional visits or exchange of letters. I must follow a healthy egoism, unperturbed by the judgment of other people, which prescribes for me the cultivation of femininity in a manner to be described more fully later. In this way only am I able to make my physical condition bearable during the day and at night at least in some measure, and obtain the sleep necessary for the recuperation of my nerves. High-grade voluptuousness eventual y passes into sleep. Maybe this is even known to medical science. Conducting myself in this manner I serve at the same time the express interest of the rays, that is God himself. If I allow God, who seems to be led by the erroneous assumption that my reason can be destroyed and who at present pursues aims which are contrary to the order of the world, to carry on his contrary policy all the time, it only leads to senseless noise in my environment, consisting mostly of madmen, as the experience of years has proved irrefutably. Only later will I be able to say more about this. At the time when my whole attitude to things changed in the manner just described, an essential change also occurred in celestial conditions, and for the very same reasons. The dissolution in my body of the rays which are separated from the totality of God's nerves, due to my power of attraction, amounts to the end of their independent existence, like death is to man. It was therefore a matter of course that God should make all attempts to avoid the fate of having to perish in my body with more and more parts of his totality, and indeed one was not very particular in choosing the means of prevention. But the attraction lost all its terror for these nerves, if and to the extent they met a feeling of soul voluptuousness in my body in which they also participated. They then regained in my body a more or less adequate substitute for the lost heavenly blessedness which itself consisted in enjoyment similar to voluptuousness, compare chapter I. The feeling of soul voluptuousness, however, was not always present in my body to the same extent. It reached its full development only when the parts of Flechsig's soul and the other tested soul parts lay in front, and thus all rays were united. However, there were also alternate periods in which soul voluptuousness was either absent or present to a much lesser extent, because the tying to celestial bodies, compare chapter 9, forced the tested souls to draw back from time to time. This caused a certain periodicity in the appearance of female characteristics on my body, of which I will have more to say later. But after the influx of God's rays had been constant for over a year, in November 1, 895, soul voluptuousness became so great at times that some rays started to like entering my body. This was noticeable first with the lower god, Ahriman, to some extent identical with the sun, see chapter 7, who being nearer partook in soul voluptuousness much more than the upper god, Ormuzd, who remained at a far greater distance. Up to the change which took place in November 1895, only the lower god, Ahriman, seemed to have a more intimate relationship with Flechsig, perhaps as a human being, perhaps as a tested soul, so that this plot, provided it existed as described in chapter 2, did not reach higher than to involve the lower god, Ahriman. Up to that time the upper god maintained a more correct, and on the whole more friendly attitude in consonance with the order of the world towards me. Now this relationship was reversed. The lower god, Ahriman, as stated, did not object to losing himself with part of his nerves in my body, because he almost always met soul voluptuousness there. He severed the close relations which apparently had existed between him and Flechsig's tested soul. The latter, at that time still possessed of a good deal of its human intelligence, now formed a sort of hostile alliance against me with the upper god. This change in the relation of the parties has persisted mostly unchanged to this day. The lower god's behavior towards me has since been generally friendly, that of the upper god much more hostile. This was shown partly in the nature of their miracles. In the course of time the miracles of the lower god became more like the relatively harmless tricks mentioned in chapter 2, partly in the talk of their respective voices. The voices emanating from the lower god, although also no longer the genuine expression of direct momentary feeling, but rather an admixture of phrases learnt by rote, still differ considerably in form and content from those of the upper god. At least their content is not only abusive and full of insulting phrases, but amounts to a kind of neutral nonsense. For instance, David and Solomon, salad and radishes, little heaps of flour, etc., are repeated again and again. In their form also they are less of a nuisance to me, because they fit in better with the natural right of man to think nothing. In time one grows accustomed to letting such nonsensical phrases as those mentioned in parentheses pass through one's mind as forms of the not thinking of anything thought. But the lower god, at least during the first years after the change described in this chapter, had at his disposal also a certain number of phrases which were of actual significance and which showed a quite correct, that is the same as my own, notion of the causes of the conflict, the means of its solution and probable future developments. But as said before, these were not genuine expressions of momentary feeling, but predetermined concoctions of thoughts spoken into my head by senseless voices in tiresome, monotonous repetition, later on mostly by miraculously produced birds. But these phrases were of great interest to me as they permitted me to see that God, after all, was not so devoid of all understanding for the necessities arising from the order of the world as other observations made him appear. I will therefore record some of these phrases. In the first place, the change in the grouping of the parties which had occurred in consequence of the increase of soul voluptuousness was signalized by the often repeated phrase, "two parties have formed." Then there were various ways of expressing the thought that the whole policy God was pursuing against me, aimed at destroying my reason, had failed. Some phrases were of a general nature without any personal implication, as for instance, knowledge and capabilities can in any case never be lost and sleep must come. Further, all nonsense, that is, the nonsense of thought reading and falsifying thoughts, cancels itself out, and permanent successes are on the side of the human being. Other phrases of the lower God were in part addressed to me personally, in part spoken through my head as it were to his colleague, the upper God, the former particularly in the already mentioned phrase, "Don't forget that you are tied to the soul conception," the latter in phrases such as, for instance, "Don't forget that all representing is nonsense," or "Don't forget that the end of the world is a contradiction in itself," or "Well, since you have made the weather dependent on one human being's thoughts," or "Well, you have made any holy occupation impossible, for instance playing the piano or playing chess, through the manifold interfering miracles." On a very few occasions one even went so far as to make a kind of confession of one's own guilt, for instance, "If only I had not put you among the fleeting improvised men," or "Well, such are the consequences of the renowned soul policy," or "What is to become of the whole cursed affair," or "If only the cursed play with human beings would cease." From time to time the confession was in these words. The feeling is lacking, that is the feeling we ought to have for every decent human being, even for the most abominable sinner, considering the means of purification provided in the order of the world. For a time the aim of the whole development was expressed by the lower God in the phrase, grammatically incomplete as is so often the case in the soul language, "Hope that voluptuousness reaches a degree, that is to say such a degree that divine rays would lose all interest in withdrawing, thus naturally resulting in a solution in consonance with the order of the world." However, the lower God also had a number of other phrases in readiness which made me shudder. In other words, I had to exert all my reason to try to uphold the conviction that he could not possibly succeed. There was talk of colossal powers on the part of God's omnipotence and of hopeless resistance on my part. It was thought necessary to remind me that the possibility for God to withdraw was boundless with the often repeated phrase, "Don't forget that eternity is boundless." Obviously what I have said above about the changed behavior of the upper and lower God and about the kind of phrases the latter used, contains a tangle of contradictions which cannot be unraveled. Almost insuperable difficulties arise even for me at every attempt to solve these contradictions. A really satisfactory solution would only be possible if one had such complete insight into the nature of God which not even I have attained, who have certainly gained deeper insight than all other human beings, because human capacity is limited. I will therefore only venture a few tentative remarks in this connection, with all the reservations arising from the insufficiency of the human apparatus for comprehension. Firstly, I cannot presume that the upper God's intellectual or moral standard is below that of the lower God. If the latter yet appears to surpass the former in that he recognizes what is possible and respects the order of the world, I think this can be accounted for by the upper God's greater distance from me compared with the lower gods. The lower and the upper God apparently have in common that they are not able to understand the living human being as an organism while they are at a distance. Both in particular seem to be caught up in the mistaken notion, hardly understandable for a human being, that everything which becomes appreciable to them from the nerves of a human being in my position, mostly only in consequence of the falsification of thoughts by the rays, is to be regarded as the manifestation of the human being's own thinking activity, also that cessation of thinking, however temporary, and the resulting state in which definite thoughts formulated in words do not echo from the nerves of a human being in a form appreciable to the rays, implies that this person's mental capacities are extinct, or to use a common though obviously misunderstood human expression, the advent of dementia. It appears then that God in both his forms tends to the erroneous idea that the nerve language resulting from the vibrations of the nerves I compare the beginning of chapter 5, is to be regarded as the real language of the human being. Thus, as some excitation of nerves also occurs in a sleeping person when dreaming, one failed to distinguish between the mental activity of a dreaming and that of a fully conscious person using his power of thinking. Naturally, I am referring only to my own case, that is to say a case in which God entered into continual contact by rays with a single human being, a contact which could no longer be severed and which therefore was contrary to the order of the world. All these erroneous ideas which have been mentioned seem only to be given up when God has come closer and then suddenly realizes from my behavior, my activities, and perhaps even from my conversation with other people, etc., that he is still dealing with a human being of completely unimpaired mental powers. It seems to be impossible for God to draw a lesson for the future from such an experience, perhaps because of some qualities innate in his nature. For these phenomena are repeated in exactly the same way year in year out, day after day, particularly the attempt to withdraw at first sight in the twinkle of an eye, with every pause in my thinking activity when the not thinking of anything thought starts, and the assumption that I have then succumbed to dementia. This is usually expressed in the fatuous phrase now he should illicit think or say I will resign myself to the fact that I am stupid, followed in senseless monotony like a barrel organ by all the other tasteless forms of speech. Why do you not say it loud, or but then for how much longer illicit will your defense against the power of the rays still be successful, etc., etc. This goes on until I proceed to take up some new occupation which proves my undiminished mental powers. It is an extremely difficult question even for me to explain this inability on the part of God to learn by experience. Perhaps one has to think of it in this way, that the more correct insight is only gained by the most forward nerve endings which are however already condemned to dissolve in my body. Those parts at a distance which start the withdrawal action do not partake in this impression, or at least not to an extent sufficient for them to change their minds. It therefore seems to me very doubtful whether it makes any practical difference if, as mentioned above, the lower God has included a number of correct ideas in his collection of phrases which he makes the voices which issue from him speak into my head. In any case, these thoughts contain nothing new for me, and the upper God, receiving only a formal acquaintance with them, is apparently quite unable to assimilate them, that is to change his usual mode of action. As the lower God is informed of the true state of affairs sooner than the upper God, he possibly allowed himself to be led by the idea that rays must speak. I compare chapter 9, this being so, it would be preferable that the content of these spoken words made sense even if in endless repetition and not consist of sheer nonsense or frank vulgarities. A long time ago I formulated the idea that God cannot learn by experience, in written notes 80 as follows: every attempt at an educative influence directed outwards must be given up as hopeless. Every day which has since passed has confirmed the correctness of this opinion. But here again, as on earlier similar occasions, I feel I must protect the reader from possible misunderstanding. Religiously minded people who are filled with the concept of God's omnipotence, omniscience, and loving kindness must find it incomprehensible that God should here be depicted as so lowly a being that he can be surpassed both morally and mentally by one single human being. However, I must emphasize that my superiority in both respects is to be understood in the most relative sense. I maintain such a superiority only as it concerns the condition contrary to the order of the world, originating from permanent and indissoluble nerve contact with one single human being. In this respect I am both the more reasonable and the better part. Man knows his own nature, and in addition I have come to know the soul character so thoroughly through years of contact with them as no other human being has before. God on the other hand does not know the living human being, and indeed he had no need to know him, as I have repeatedly stressed before. This is by no means irreconcilable with my acknowledging God's eternal wisdom and goodness in all other respects, particularly in supernatural matters such as the creation and evolution of the world. I would like to end this chapter by remarking that now at the end of almost 5 years, things have developed so far that the upper God has taken up the same attitude towards me as the lower God has done since the change of circumstances described in this chapter. The miracles of the upper God are beginning to assume the harmless character which mostly has characterized the miracles of the lower God. As example, I will only mention my cigar ash being thrown about on the table or on the piano, my mouth and my hands being soiled with food during meals, etc. It fills me with satisfaction that I predicted this development of things years ago. As proof, I will quote the relative entry in my diary, number 17 of March 8, 1898. We would like to express the opinion by way of conjecture, that perhaps even the posterior ormuzd will lose his interest in disturbing voluptuousness, like the posterior Ahriman has lost it in the last 2.5 years, so that inner voluptuousness transfigured and ennobled by human imagination would offer greater attraction than outer f.g. when contrary to the order of the world. A few explanatory remarks are necessary to understand this quotation. Posterior Ahriman and posterior ormuzd were the names given, first by the voices and not by me, to the lower God and upper God respectively, when one or the other had got behind by the other pushing into the foreground, which occurred innumerable times daily. Inner voluptuousness is the sole voluptuousness which originates in my body. The expression outward f.g. contrary to the order of the world, refers to my observations that the taking up of putrid matter by pure rays is connected with a kind of voluptuous sensation for them. The choice of the word f.g. is not due to my liking for vulgar terms, but having had to listen to the words f.k. and f.g. thousands of times, I have used the term for short in this little note to indicate the behavior of rays which was contrary to the order of the world. Besides the events described in the previous chapter, certain changes in the heavenly conditions occurred during that time and in the following year or two which, although less important, are touched on here for the sake of completeness. They concern mainly the fate of tested souls. These, as mentioned before, had been very numerous for some time in consequence of the partition of souls. A large part of them were occupied almost only in participating in the so-called circumventory movements, a maneuver invented by the main parts of Flechsig's soul. Its purpose was to attack the innocently approaching divine rays from behind and so force them to surrender. The picture of this phenomenon is still distinct in my memory, but I must forego describing it in words, nor am I able to say with certainty whether this phenomenon belonged to a time before or after the tying to celestial bodies. So much is certain, that the great number of tested soul parts had eventually become a nuisance to God's omnipotence itself. After I had succeeded in drawing down to myself a considerable part of them, God's omnipotence started a raid among them one particular day. The consequence was that from then on Flechsig's soul remained only in one or two shapes and von W.'s soul in one single shape. The latter seems even to have given up the tying voluntarily. From then on it sat for some time, probably a year, mostly in my mouth or eyes, troubling me only little, in fact even providing me with some entertainment, as I could keep up a kind of exchange of ideas with it, in which I however was almost always the giving and von W.'s soul the receiving part. I still remember with some amusement the very funny impression this soul made when finally, almost completely without thoughts and limited only to visual impressions, it started to join in searching when I was looking for some object in my environment, that is to say, it joined in looking out of my eyes. About the end of 1897 von W.'s soul eventually disappeared altogether unnoticed by me. I had lately become so accustomed to its company that one day, not having thought of it for some time, I suddenly realized that it had vanished. I found myself moved to play the funeral march from Beethoven's Eroica on the piano in honor of its departing. Flechsig's soul is still present as a meager remnant I tied onto somewhere, but I have good reason to assume that it long ago lost its intelligence, that is to say, it is now also totally devoid of thoughts, so that it can hardly even enjoy with satisfaction its own heavenly existence, which it had unlawfully achieved against God's omnipotence, and this once again represents one of the most glowing confirmations of the order of the world, according to which nothing can maintain itself permanently, which contradicts it. And so the previous tested souls vanished from the scene with one small exception. Thinking of this event, I cannot refrain from giving a few details of the very peculiar names which they had up to their disappearance. Even if they are of little interest to readers, it is important for me to remember them and so keep fresh the terrifying and gruesome memories connected with them. The total opposition to God's omnipotence, consisting of Flexigs and VWS soul parts as well as their other party followers, advance guards, etc., called themselves for some time the So What Party. This hackneyed phrase originated from Flexig's soul, which had the habit of answering all questions about what was to become of this whole cursed affair. That the whole affair had gone utterly astray seems to have been known to God's omnipotence, with a mocking and indifferent so what. This answer again is most characteristic of the soul character. Souls after all know of no care for the future, but let momentary enjoyment suffice. Translated into the human sphere, the so what of Flexig's soul would mean one do not care a damn for the future, as long as I feel well at the moment. Therefore, when only two parts of Flexig's soul remained, the more distant one was called the posterior Flexig, and the one that was a little nearer, by the way the one that had always been of weaker intelligence, was called the middle so what party. Of von W.'s soul parts, the abdominal putrefaction of von W. has been mentioned earlier. This probably had the most impure nerves and therefore exhibited the most abominable intent towards me, and towards God's omnipotence unabashed impudence. This found expression in certain classical phrases which did not fit in with the movement of my own nerves, nor with the accustomed rhythm of the rays, such as "in a way this is unbearable, permit me," etc. The latter expression was used when it was to be dislodged from its position. It hung on the opposite wall of my bedroom when I was lying in bed. It was almost equaled in impudence of intent by the so-called midday von W. It had this name because it was said to have charge of meals, particularly midday meals. A more decent, almost reasonable, if changeable character, was shown by two other of von W.'s soul's shapes, the anyhow von W and the zero damn von W, both names used by themselves. The phrase zero damn in particular was a remnant of the basic language, in which the words zero damn, that is hard to say, were used whenever the souls became aware of a happening inconsistent with the order of the world. For instance, zero damn, it is extremely hard to say that God allows himself to be f. Particularly dangerous for a time was a really very small part of von W.'s soul which was called the scourge of von W. because of a miracle practiced exclusively by him. He used to move a little scourge about in my skull, and with it caused serious destruction and often fairly severe pain. During the time of my stay in Dr. Pearson's asylum, the Devil's Kitchen, there was also a shape of von W.'s soul for the formation of which some of my own nerves must have been used, because it was called the little von W. Schreber. This was the best intentioned of all. He sometimes even achieved, in his miracles, the so-called golden drop, a miracle usually practiced only by God's omnipotence, in which some fluid like balsam was placed on damaged parts of my head and elsewhere I could feel it distinctly, so that all at once an immediate curative effect was achieved. My outward life was no longer quite as monotonous during the time after the change described in Chapter 1-3 as it had been earlier in the period of my immobility, yet there was little variety, as may be expected from living in an asylum. I still spent the best part of my time playing the piano and chess. The number of printed scores at my disposal had grown considerably through presents from my relatives. I started to make written notes as I had been provided with some colored pencils and later with other writing material. My circumstances were so pitiful that even a pencil or a rubber was guarded by me like a real treasure. My note-taking consisted at first only of a few unconnected thoughts or words which one put down. Later, beginning with the year 1897, one started to keep regular diaries, in which one entered all my experiences. Earlier, but still in 1896, one was limited to meager entries in a small calendar. But one also started to sketch my future memoirs, which one had already planned. This sketch is contained in a little brown book, entitled From My Life. It has served me as a welcome support of my memory while elaborating the present memoirs. Anybody interested in this sketch, which was kept in shorthand, would find there many more items which one have not incorporated into my memoirs. They show the reader that the content of my revelations was immeasurably richer than what one could incorporate in the limited space of the memoirs. Finally, since the late autumn of 1897 to one have written down certain observations mentioned in footnote 80 and the little studies in small notebooks B, C and, etc., with which at least during the summer it was possible to occupy myself from daybreak on. I have already said that I suffered these conditions for 2.5 years, in the last resort only because human beings did not appreciate supernatural matters. Some time after the change recounted in chapter 13. Perhaps at the end of 1895 or the beginning of 1896, I had a number of experiences which led me to a critical examination of my ideas about the fire-eating improvised men, play with human beings, and such like, in consequence of which I arrived at a slightly different point of view. In particular, I remember 3 events which made me hesitate whether what until then I had considered true and correct was really so. Firstly, taking part in the Christmas festivities of the family of the director of the asylum, Dr. Weber, in the year 1895. Secondly, receiving a letter from my sister-in-law in Cologne on the Rhine addressed to me and bearing the postmark of Cologne. Thirdly, a children's procession celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Peace of Frankfurt, 10th of May 1896, which I saw from my window passing along a street of a suburb of Pirna which runs below it. After these and similar events, soon regular correspondence was added, and reading newspapers which were subscribed for by my relatives, I could no longer doubt that a real race of human beings in the same number and distribution as before did in fact exist. But this caused difficulties. How was I to combine this fact with my earlier impressions apparently pointing to the contrary? This difficulty remains even today, and I must confess that I am faced with an unsolved riddle, one which is probably insoluble for human beings. I have no doubt whatever that my early ideas were not simply delusions and hallucinations, because even now I still receive impressions daily and hourly which make it perfectly clear to me that, in Hamlet's words, there is something rotten in the state of Denmark, that is to say, in the relationship between God and mankind. But how the present state of things developed historically, whether by sudden changes or gradual transition, and to what extent apart from the manifestations of life caused by the influence of rays, miracles, manifestations of life occur independently and uninfluenced by the rays, remains even for me an obscure point. I am quite sure that expressions and phrases like fleeting improvised men and cursed play with human beings, the questions, what is going to happen to this cursed affair, etc., as well as the talk about new human beings from Schreber's spirit, did not originate in my head, but were spoken into it from outside. This alone would make me assume that the ideas connected with them have some basis in reality corresponding to some historical events. Moreover, in the course of the last 6 years I have unintermittently received impressions, and still receive them daily and hourly, which furnish me with incontestable proof that everything spoken and done by human beings near me is due to the effect of miracles, and directly connected with the rays coming nearer and alternately striving to withdraw again. I have already mentioned in chapter 7 that every word spoken near me or with me, every human action however small which is combined with some noise, for instance opening the door locks on my corridor, pressing the latch on the door of my room, the entry of an attendant into my room, etc., is accompanied by a sensation of a painful blow directed at my head. The sensation of pain is like a sudden pulling inside my head, which calls forth a very unpleasant feeling as soon as God has withdrawn to an excessive distance, and may be combined with the tearing off of part of the bony substance of my skull. At least that is how it feels. As long as I talk aloud in my room or in the garden turned towards God, everything around me is deathly quiet, and God has no wish to withdraw, as he receives the direct impression of the activity of a human being in complete possession of his senses. This creates a feeling in me at times as if I were moving among walking corpses, so completely seem the people, attendants and patients, suddenly to have lost the capacity to say one single word. The same happens as long as my gaze rests on a female being. But as soon as I turn my gaze or allow my eyes to be closed by miracles, or as soon as I change from talking aloud to silence without at the same time starting some mental occupation, in other words when I give myself up to thinking nothing, the following phenomena which are interrelated occur almost at once at first sight. 1. Noises around me, mostly consisting in violent outbursts among the lunatics who of course form the majority of those around me. 12. In my own person the advent of the bellowing miracle when my muscles serving the processes of respiration are set in motion by the lower god Iriman, in such a way that I am forced to emit bellowing noises, unless I try very hard to suppress them. Sometimes this bellowing recurs so frequently and so quickly that it becomes almost unbearable and at night makes it impossible to remain in bed. 13. The winds arise, however not uninfluenced by the existing state of the weather. But short blasts of wind coinciding with pauses in my thinking are quite unmistakable. 14. The cries of help of those of God's nerves separated from the total mass, sound the more woeful the farther away God has withdrawn from me, and the greater therefore the distance which those nerves have to travel, obviously in a state of some anxiety. All these phenomena happen hundreds of times every day, must have observed them in the course of years tens of thousands if not hundreds of thousands of times with exactly the same regularity. I have repeatedly pointed to the reason. Every time my thinking activity ceases, God instantly regards my mental powers as extinct, the desired destruction of my reason LTHE dementia, achieved and the possibility of a withdrawal thus brought about. And so the withdrawal action is started, and to achieve it an interference produced by miracle in the sense given in chapter 10, page 136. This is the noise mentioned in 1.1, above. Simultaneously and almost immediately the so-called bellowing miracle is produced by the lower god one of the resolution whether in spite of the patient's present favorable behavior, there are grounds for anxiety in the nature of the existing mental illness that the appellant might endanger the above-mentioned and other important interests of life through insensible and injudicious actions, as soon as the freedom of legal action is restored to him. In my earlier report I pointed to the fact that in the nature of so deep-seated an illness as paranoia it is impossible to predict whether and in what direction at a given moment the existing pathological ideas will influence the patient's conduct. I also mentioned that many paranoiacs with a developed delusional system live in the world without difficulty, following their profession, until at a given opportunity they reveal their pathological condition by contrary assertions. I have given above an example of how much the appellant can be disturbed by external events and forced to inappropriate action through his pathological revelations, and therefore I have only to repeat that even now it is not impossible that the appellant could be influenced in his actions by pathological processes. When the appellant states IPP 118 and 119, that the insight gained into the true nature of divine affairs, the certainty that he is dealing with God and divine miracles, have become the center of his whole life, that God still reveals himself to him daily and hourly in his miracles and in his speech, that his constant cheerfulness of mood, his benevolence towards people little worthy of it, etc., rest on this, then it is not likely that this mighty current of thoughts and feelings would never under any circumstances influence his assertions, particularly as even at present some of his actions are caused against his will directly by miracles. The appellant's assurances that he does not permit his delusions to influence his affairs can hardly alter this, as on the one hand he need not become aware of such influences and on the other the pathological processes may gain so much in strength that resistance becomes impossible. No assurance can therefore be given in face of the nature of the illness that important life interests of the patient might not be endangered were he freed from his tutelage. Two other points are important medically. Firstly, it is doubtful whether mere apprehension for the future, the possibility of endangering himself severely, is sufficient grounds for the assumption that he is incapable of looking after his affairs. Secondly, the danger for the future is now not great, because the sphere of the appellant's delusional ideas has gradually become more sharply demarcated from the rest of his ideas, and has for some time led a relatively separate existence. Experience so far shows that his judgment and treatment of a number of important life interests were not significantly influenced by these complexes of delusional ideas, but have been carried out faultlessly. Present conditions do not entitle one to expect any great change in the appellant's mental state, e.g. deterioration, in the foreseeable future. Apprehension for the future, therefore, need not weigh as heavily today as previously in judging the overall situation. Signed, Dr. Weber. Pronounced 1/4th July 1902. Signed, Dr. F. 6 Arster. Clerk to the Court. Judgment 01 The Royal Superior Country Court Dresden of July 14, 1902. Day of Exhibition July 14, 1902. Signed, Die F. Clerk to the Court. In the name of the King. In the case of Daniel Paul Schreber, Doctor of Law, Senatspresident, retired, formerly residing in Dresden, now in the country asylum Sonnenstein, plaintiff and appellant, solicitor, Windisch, versus the public prosecutor at the Royal Country Court, Dresden. Now public prosecutor at the Royal Superior Country Court, Dresden, defendant and respondent, contesting the order placing plaintiff under tutelage, the Royal Superior Country Court of Saxony, with Judge Hardrott, President of the Senate of the Court, together with councillors of the Superior Court Vogel, Dr. Steinmetz, N. Icola, Dr. Paul, fined. Appeal of plaintiff is allowed, and the judgment of the 7th Civil Chamber of the District Court, Dresden of April 13, 1901 confirming the order of the lower court, Dresden, of March 13, 1900 placing plaintiff under tutelage is rescinded. Plaintiff is allowed costs of the proceedings including those of the Court of Appeal. Plaintiff was placed under tutelage as an insane person at the instance of the Royal Prosecuting Authority by an order of the District Court at Dresden of March 13, 1900. The district judge declared that he was convinced by virtue of Dr. Weber's expert report in whose care plaintiff had been since 1894, and by the impressions he personally gained by interrogating the patient, that plaintiff was deprived of the use of his reason and therefore incapable of managing his affairs. He held that Dr. Schreber was dominated by delusions, that he considered himself chosen to redeem the world and to restore to it the lost state of blessedness. This however he could only do by first being transformed from a man into a woman. In this sexual transformation the patient imagined himself the object of continuous divine miracles, and believed he could hear the birds and the winds talking to him, which fortified him in his belief in miracles. A person influenced by such delusions and hallucinations is no longer master of his own free will. He is subject to external influences independent of his own will, against which he is powerless and which render him incapable of managing his actions and affairs according to practical and reasonable deliberation. Plaintiff in due course contested the order placing him under tutelage by bringing a legal action for suspension of the order. He denies that he is in any way prevented from managing his affairs by the mental illness of paranoia, diagnosed by the medical expert. Factual evidence of this assumption had not been produced by the district court. It is merely a petitio principii when it is stated that, a person under the influence of delusions and hallucinations is not master of his own free will. What to the court may appear as delusions has nothing whatever to do with the question of his legal capacity. In any case his illness is not of a kind to make him incapable of judging correctly those matters of social behavior which in law are his affairs, even if one understands affairs in the broadest sense, that is to say including everything concerning life, health, freedom, honor, family, fortune. In all these matters the clarity of his judgment was not clouded by his illness. Nobody would be able to say of him that he does not bestow the necessary care upon his body and health. Although he admitted suicidal ideas in the first years of his illness, he says they disappeared long ago with the continual improvement in his condition. That he sets much store by his personal freedom and his honor was proved by his endeavor to free himself from the shackles of tutelage. His sense of manly honor was hurt by being treated in law as an infant. He is on the best terms with his wife and his family and also has their interests at heart. Finally, he is completely capable of managing his financial affairs himself. He feels he is as safe as every other person against being taken advantage of in business dealings. Even the district court in the order placing him under tutelage held that he is still capable of presiding over a panel of judges, of deciding the most intricate cases and delivering most difficult counsel's opinions with striking juristical raisonning. If this is the case, it is difficult to understand why he should not be capable of dealing with the simple legal acts involved in looking after his own well-ordered finances. The country court ordered a delegated judge to interrogate plaintiff personally, and the director of the country asylum, Sonnenstein, Dr. Weber, to give a further report on his mental state with special reference to whether the nature of plaintiff's illness and the medical observations made on him in the last few years up to the present time give grounds for the assumption that plaintiff, in case the order for his tutelage were rescinded, would endanger his life, his health, his property, or any other interests of life by unreasonable actions. The result of the judge's personal interrogation of plaintiff is laid down on page 38 ff of the protocol, while the medical expert Dr. Weber has rendered the requested report in a detailed written document of November 28, 1900, pages 44 to 53. With it, the medical expert handed to the court Dr. Schreber's manuscript in 23 copybooks under the title Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, dealing with his religious views and the history of his illness. The country court in its judgment of April 13, 1901 dismissed Dr. Schreber's action. It agreed with Weber's expert opinion that plaintiff's high intelligence and his capacity of thinking according to formal logic might not be markedly clouded by his mental illness. Nevertheless, there was danger of unreasonable action. As perusal of the memoirs proves and the medical expert Dr. Weber confirms, plaintiff suffers to a considerable extent from hallucinations and delusions, which center on his relation to God and his exceptional position in the universe. This delusional system dominates his whole feeling and thinking. It influences his conception of the world and his judgment of men and things. Under such circumstances, it is quite incalculable what plaintiff's decisions might be if freedom of action were restored to him, whether they would be taken according to the sphere of ideas which remained comparatively untouched by his madness, or under compulsion of his morbid psychic processes. In two matters, the detrimental effect of Dr. Schreber's delusional ideas on his whole outlook is particularly clear: in his relation to his wife, who suffers much from his delusion of being unmanned, and to whom, when she tries to object to his ideas, he always readily suggests that she could divorce him. Further, plaintiff has the urgent desire to make his memoirs known to the public in print, and strives to have the order of tutelage rescinded mainly to be able to conclude a valid contract for publishing his manuscript. Actually, the memoirs are quite unfit for publication. Plaintiff would thereby compromise his family and himself in an unheard of fashion, might even expose himself to the danger of criminal prosecution. That plaintiff cannot recognize this himself proves to what extent, in consequence of his pathologically altered conception of the world, the proper appreciation of the actual circumstances of life, the capacity of distinguishing between the permitted and the impermissible, have been lost. Plaintiff appealed against the country court's judgment and repeated his request for rescission of the order placing him under the care of a guardian, while the public prosecutor asked for dismissal of the appeal. The contested judgment referred to in its entirety, besides all documents cited in it, Schreber's personal written communication to the court and to the asylum authorities, as well as the content of the tutelage file of the district court CRI 64/99, were read out in court. The reading of Schreber's memoirs was restricted to chapters 1, 2, 18, 19, as agreed between both parties. Plaintiff appeared personally at the hearings before the Court of Appeal and frequently pleaded himself beside his legal representative. He presented from his own pen a number of rejoinders contradicting the conclusions of the first instance and Dr. Weber's expert opinion on which it was based, and discussed thoroughly his opposite opinion in factual and legal respects. Plaintiff stressed that the formal treatment which he personally gave to his case should be taken into consideration by the judges in deciding the question of his legal capacity. A person who is capable of dealing with so involved a legal matter in self-composed representations with circumspection and expert knowledge, and is tactful and discreet where other people's opinions are concerned, should be trusted to be capable also of managing the simpler and less important matters of ordinary life in a competent way. The following of plaintiff's pleadings are to be stressed. First, plaintiff denies that in the district court he admitted being or having been mentally ill. He only concedes that his nervous system has for years been in a morbid state, but his mind, that is to say the working together of the sum total of his intellectual powers, is as clear and healthy as any person's. When the medical expert suggests that he is suffering from a form of insanity, a paranoia, in that he declares a priori everything as morbid imaginings that plaintiff reported in his memoirs about the intimate communication between himself and God and about divine miracles, he goes in the face of truth. He naturally knows the medical expert could do no other than apply to his IDR. Schreber's case the standards of common scientific experience, and he does not in the least want to chide him because of this approach. Dr. Weber stands with his feet firmly planted in rationalism, which denies out of hand the possibility of supernatural happenings. In opposition to him, plaintiff champions fundamentally the contrary point of view, the certainty of his knowledge of God and the absolute conviction that he is dealing with God and divine miracles tower for him above all human science. It has become and must remain for him the center of his whole life, because God still reveals himself anew to him daily and hourly in his miracles and in his language. His steady serenity of spirit rests on this, it remains with him despite all the adversities of life and can be observed by everyone who meets him. From it also springs the calm, kindly feeling which he entertains even towards those who in earlier years unwittingly hurt him, and this explains the great stress he lays on the publication of his memoirs. He does not wish to make propaganda for his belief in miracles, much less would he want to sacrifice one penny for it. His only reason in wishing to publish his memoirs is to raise doubt whether it is possible that after all his delusional system, as one sees fit to call it, has a basis in truth and he has really been granted a glance behind that dark veil which otherwise hides the beyond from the eyes of man. He is convinced that after the publication of his book the scientific world will take a serious interest in his person. Far from wishing to play the prophet of a new religion, he looks upon himself solely as an object of scientific observation. Whatever one may think of his belief in miracles, no one is entitled to see in it a mental defect which makes plaintiff require state care. One does not usually and without further reason declare the adherents of spiritualism mentally ill and put them under a guardian, although their way of looking at things supernaturally is also neither shared nor comprehended by the vast majority of their fellow men. Even supposing that psychiatrically speaking he had to be counted mentally ill, it would have to be proved that in consequence he is incapable of managing his affairs. The expert refused to express a definite opinion on this last point. He only stated that it was unpredictable whether and in how far plaintiff might be induced to act unreasonably, if his freedom of action were restored to him. With such general forms of speech and vague fears the matter is not settled. Rather it would have to be proved on the basis of facts and actual experiences, particularly those of the last few years, that and in what direction he has a tendency to act unreasonably because of his delusions and hallucinations. He admits that there is less chance of making such observations on a person detained in an asylum than on a person at large. Strictly speaking, the medical expert Dr. Weber only came to know plaintiff more closely since Easter 1900, when he was permitted to share meals regularly at the family table. This has changed considerably in the meantime. Since the previous report was furnished, more than a year has passed during which he has been granted considerable freedom of movement by the authorities of the asylum. He has undertaken numerous greater and smaller excursions, visited places of public amusement, shops, churches, theaters, and concerts, in the last 6 months without being accompanied by an attendant, and was provided with a certain amount of money. He declares that nobody will ever have noticed the least sign of faulty conduct on these occasions. It never occurred to him to molest other people by making known his delusions. He believes, for instance, to be justified in maintaining that the ladies of the family table of the director of the asylum would not have the faintest idea of his delusions, unless informed of them some other way. It is true that at times he mentioned them to his wife, but this is adequately explained by the close bond that exists between them. The only way in which his behavior to the outside world is influenced to a certain extent by his delusional ideas and which could perhaps make him appear unreasonable in the eyes of other people, is the circumstance also stressed by the expert Dr. Weber, that he sometimes decks himself out with some feminine ornaments, ribbons, trumpery necklaces, and such like. This he admits might appear silly to many people, but states that he has good reasons for it. He thereby usually achieves considerable amelioration of the states of bellowing which would otherwise be extremely troublesome to him and his environment. At worst it is only a whim, absolutely harmless and not in any way detrimental either to himself or others. The financial aspect does not enter into consideration, the whole lot cost him hardly more than a few marks. The medical expert stressed in his report. The most important point for judging the patient's capacity for appropriate action is the fact that everything which to objective observation appears as delusions and hallucinations is for him unalterable truth and adequate motive for action. He unreservedly admits the first part of this, but must counter the second with an unconditional no. The religious conceptions he cherishes could never lead him to unreasonable action in practical life. They are completely without influence on his capacity to manage his own affairs and care for his interests. He cannot understand how Dr. Weber arrived at the contrary opinion. He certainly has not given any grounds for it in his actions up till now. He does not dream of bringing pecuniary sacrifices to further his belief or to have the presence of nerves of voluptuousness in him confirmed. The certainty of his knowledge of God is so great and unshakable, that he is indifferent to what other people think about the truth or probability of his ideas. He wishes to be trusted in his assurances about his future behavior, because he has never given any cause to doubt the inviolability of his love of truth. The expert's apprehensions that it was entirely incalculable to what extent plaintiff could be led to unreasonable action by his delusions are therefore unfounded. The country court itself considers this apprehension justified chiefly in 2 points. Firstly, in respect to the matrimonial relation to his wife which could be destroyed by rescinding the tutelage order, and secondly in view of his plan to publish his memoirs, as he would thereby compromise himself and even run the risk of a penalty. But neither of these considerations suffices to uphold his tutelage. A. The matrimonial bond between himself and his wife has in consequence of his illness for years been as good as non-existent and would remain in abeyance, if his tutelage were continued in the future, perhaps even to the end of the life of either spouse. It is possible that the return to his family for which he strives might entail inconveniences for his wife. But this does not come into consideration because a person can be placed under tutelage only in his own interests, in order to safeguard him from the threatening dangers of his unreasonable actions, but never to protect other persons, however closely related, from unpleasantness. Of course he has legal liabilities to his wife in that he has to provide adequate maintenance for her. He would never shrink from fulfilling this legal obligation, rather he would at all times be prepared to provide his wife with sufficient means to live apart from him, in case after his return from the asylum circumstances should arise in which she could not reasonably be expected to live with him. The experts remark that, when his wife argues about his belief in miracles, he is quick to indicate that she could divorce him, apparently rests on a misunderstanding. He has never toyed with the idea of divorce nor shown indifference to the continuance of the marital bond. The whole extensive correspondence he maintained with his wife for years proves how heartfelt his love for her still is and how it pains him that she too has been made so deeply unhappy by his illness. Accordingly he discussed the possibility of divorce only by mentioning a few times that if his disturbing states of bellowing should make life with him intolerable, or should it be impossible for her to continue loving and respecting him because of certain other peculiarities arising from his belief in miracles, she had the legal right to divorce him. B. The second example of to what extent he acts under the compulsion of his pathological ideas was seen by the district court in the content of the memoirs and his wish to see them published. He never concealed from himself and in fact expressed in the preface to the memoirs that there are certain objections to their publication. Should they reach the printer, he would continue to keep in mind erasing certain passages and toning down certain expressions beforehand. He does not intend publishing them in their present form. He only submitted the manuscript for inspection to the publishers in Leipzig with whom he entered into negotiations about the publication of the II Memoirs. Even if the manuscript remained completely unaltered, he wishes to protest strongly that he would thereby compromise any member of his family, as the district court seems to assume. There can be no question of this. The memoirs do not contain the least that might be construed as damaging to the reputation of his father, his brother, or his wife. Plaintiff accepts fully any risk of compromising himself in publishing his memoirs. The worst that could befall him is that one would consider him mentally deranged, and this one does in any case. Actually, he believes that there is no danger that anybody who reads his memoirs carefully would think less of him afterwards than before. At all times his only aim has been to discover the truth. It is true, as the contested judgment criticizes in his manuscript, that he occasionally uses offensive strong language. But these expressions do not originate from him, but occur only where he relates the content of the conversations the voices held with him. It was not his fault that these voices frequently used expressions not fit for drawing rooms. Besides, his memoirs were not written for flappers or high school girls. Admittedly, there is one person who might feel hurt by the publication of the memoirs and who might possibly bring a libel action against him. It is Professor Flechsig in Leipzig. Even here, however, plaintiff only related events about him which, from information received from the voices talking to him, he had to believe were true. He is certain that Flechsig will forgive him, and he had even thought of sending him a copy of the memoirs because he believed that Flechsig would take a scientific interest in the problems discussed. It was far from him to attack Flechsig's personal honor. But should, despite his expectations, the publication of the manuscript lead to his being punished for libel, he was prepared for the sake of the cause to accept this new martyrdom also, and no one in his opinion had the right to prevent him from doing so. The public prosecutor considers the continuance of the tutelage legally necessary and dictated by plaintiff's own interests. He holds there is not the slightest doubt that Dr. Schreber suffers from paranoia, judging from his pleadings before the Court of Appeal. It is equally beyond doubt that in consequence he is not in a position to manage his own affairs raisonnably, although the medical expert, wishing to limit his competence, did not express a sufficiently definite opinion on this point. As Dr. Weber rightly says, psychic processes are an organic unity, and it is impossible that those areas of mental life not immediately filled with delusional ideas would remain entirely untouched by them. One should not be misled by plaintiff's verbal and written statements giving in part the impression of clarity. There is no need to detail individual facts to show plaintiff's incapacity to manage his own affairs. Such facts exist. For instance, plaintiff is obviously incapable of judging how much longer he will have to remain in the asylum. If his tutelage were rescinded, he would sooner or later certainly endeavor to be discharged from the asylum. In one of his letters to the lawyer Dr. Thiermer, his counsel in the district court, pages 68, 74 of the file, he wrote, "He knows exactly and better than any doctor what is good for him physically and mentally, as it is a matter of defending himself against the harmful effects of divine miracles." One may see from this that plaintiff has no real insight into his illness and that he will not listen to advice. In addition, he is visited by hallucinations which, according to Dr. Weber's evidence, preoccupy him in the middle of a conversation and disturb his concentration. It is evident that this might be disastrous when he is dealing with money matters. It is not so simple to administer his and his wife's estate. According to the last inventory made by the president of the district court Schmidt in Leipzig in his capacity as guardian, p. 177 of the tutelage file, it consists in part of real estate and in a share of a copyright. Dr. Schreber's behavior towards his wife also gives rise to well-founded doubts whether he would be capable of freeing himself from the influence of his delusional ideas in his dispositions for her. Despite all assurances to the contrary given by plaintiff in this respect, one must also fear that in pursuing the idea of a divine mission he might be led to expenses which he would not incur as a man acting of his own free will. How much Schreber's whole way of thinking is faulty is shown not least by his persistent and firm intention of publishing his memoirs. Plaintiff denies all these allegations. He states that the experience gained since Or. Weber's last report of 28 November 1900, has proved that despite all alleged delusions and hallucinations he is perfectly capable of conducting reasonably his business and other affairs alone and in accordance with his legal interests. He is convinced that in the face of these new experiences Or. Weber himself would no longer wish to maintain his statements in an earlier report about plaintiff's incapacity to manage his affairs. It is correct that he strives to achieve his release from the asylum in the not-too-distant future. He expects no further improvement in his health by continuing his stay at Sonnenstein. But a little delay may yet be necessary. He agrees that it might be sensible to remain in the asylum as long as his states of bellowing persist, although he has observed that the bellowing occurred only while he was in the asylum but almost never outside, when traveling, etc. But these vociferations have nothing to do with his capacity or otherwise of managing his affairs. They are only a welfare and police matter which in certain circumstances might give the asylum authorities in their capacity as organs of the security police the right to keep him in the asylum against his will. He wishes to repeat, however, that no force would be necessary in this direction, as he would not oppose remaining in the asylum while disturbances could be feared from frequent attacks of bellowing. The Court of Appeal in its resolution on the evidence of December 30, 1901 asked Dr. Weber to furnish a supplement to his first report clarifying three matters under A, B, C of the resolution, and particularly requested information about the experiences made since November 1900 respecting plaintiff's capacity to move freely outside the asylum and manage his affairs. Dr. Weber rendered the report, p. 203h, in writing under oath, and supplemented it with a postscript, p. 231, prompted by some of Dr. Schreber's, p. 223h, arguments against the factual basis of his report. Both reports were read in court. Plaintiff believes that the statements of the later report can be interpreted as more favorable to him. He is satisfied that the medical expert is now in doubt as to whether continuation of his tutelage is imperative. In point of fact, in the last 2 years not a single instance of unreasonable action could be proved against him. Even the occasional disturbing bellowing sounds which still seem to cause the medical expert some apprehension, but which outside the asylum never amount to a serious annoyance and breach of the peace, have lately decreased. During his week's stay in Leipzig they never once occurred, as his relatives would confirm. As the bellowing is caused automatically, that is to say independently of his will, it could not possibly be considered a sign of a tendency to unreasonable behavior. The medical expert is wrong in stating that he acted unreasonably in a recent illness, diarrhea and vomiting, by refusing the medicines ordered for him. He closely followed medical instructions, proof, attendant Muller, and it cannot be said that he fails to appreciate the value of medicines, even despises them. The reverse is seen to be true from the fact that he did not refuse to take sleeping drugs for his insomnia. Besides, he has diligently sought every opportunity lately of conversing with other people, including strangers, while on his walks, excursions, and journeys. He wished to refer to their evidence. Of the great many people concerned he wished to name as witnesses for the time being only the following: his brother-in-law, the merchant Karl Jung in Leipzig, and his wife, his eldest sister, his brother-in-law, the country court judge Kraus in Chemnitz and his wife, his youngest sister, his guardian, president of the district court Schmidt in Leipzig and his wife, the physician Dr. Nakans, the lawyer Dr. Schill, Dr. Hennig, the publisher Nauerhard, the possible publisher of his memoirs, all in Leipzig. Finally, the retired president of the court Thierbach in Dresden and Majors Meissner and Sander in Pirna. They would all confirm that during their meetings with him they received the impression of a completely reasonable person capable of every demand of social and business life, in whom they as laymen did not notice the least sign of a mental illness, let alone one making him incapable of managing his affairs. More recently a very important fact was added for judging his legal capacity. In order to make the asylum authorities take a more definite stand regarding the question of his tutelage, He tried to sound them whether there was any objection to his possible discharge from the asylum in the near future. He did not mean immediate discharge from one day to the next. The precarious health of his wife, with whom he wishes to live together again, and the choice of a home suitable for her as well as himself, would require careful consideration and preparations which would take time. He also assumes that the asylum authorities would wish to consult his guardian and perhaps even his wife before his discharge, and above all would wish to ensure that living arrangements had been made. He therefore formulated his question in a letter to Dr. Weber of May 29, 1902, in the following way: whether, the present state of affairs prevailing and provided no objection were raised by the guardian or judicial authority against discharge, and provided his wife were not averse to having him or some other residence were found, the asylum authorities would consider granting his wish to be discharged in due course, taking into consideration only welfare police matters. Dr. Weber answered on May 30, 1902, p. 252b/253 in the file, as follows: the asylum authorities would at present not place an obstacle in the way of your discharge with the provisos mentioned in your letter, and as long as there is no deterioration in your condition. For the asylum authorities, apart from possible medical advice, the decisive moment when considering discharge or a trial leave period, is only the possible danger which the patient's illness may bring to himself or others. Such does not exist in the present case. Etc. 1I. The public prosecutor acknowledges the letters exchanged between plaintiff and Dr. Weber. Nevertheless, he opposes rescinding the tutelage, because despite all plaintiff's protestations to the contrary, the fear cannot be denied that he may be driven to foolish and unreasonable actions under the compulsion of his delusional insanity. For instance, plaintiff would certainly have to bring considerable financial sacrifice in order to carry through his planned publication of the memoirs, as an ordinary contract with a publisher is most unlikely to be concluded. Plaintiff counters the last point as follows: the publication of the memoirs is planned, according to preliminary agreement with the publisher Nauerhard in Leipzig, in the form of a contract on the basis of a commission, the same form of publication in which his father's medical indoor gymnastics appeared. The financial risk he runs is restricted to the production costs of the book, a sum of marks. Such an expenditure is small in relation to his total means, which may be estimated at marks. For the rest, he wishes to repeat his previous assurance that he would not make propaganda for his belief in miracles, and that it would not occur to him to sacrifice 1 penny of his capital for it. The court is in no doubt that the appellant is insane. One would not wish to argue with him whether in fact he suffers from a mental illness known as paranoia. He lacks insight into the pathological nature of the inspirations and ideas which move him. What to objective observation is hallucination and delusion is for him irrefutable certainty. Even now he holds fast to the conviction that God manifests himself to him directly and continuously performs his miracles on him. This conviction, as he says himself, towers high above all human insight and science. But it is not sufficient grounds for placing plaintiff under tutelage that his mental processes are pathologically disturbed. The Civil Code demands under 6, number 1, apart from the existence of a mental illness, that the patient in consequence thereof is incapable of managing his affairs. Not every mental abnormality therefore leads necessarily to a negation of legal capacity. Placing under tutelage is justified only when mental illness is so severe that it prevents the patient from managing all affairs like a child under the age of 7. If the patient is not completely deprived of the capacity of acting sensibly and reasonably, but is only restricted through mental illness in appreciating special matters or a certain range of his affairs, this can in certain circumstances cause him to be made a ward of the court I-19 Lo, Section 2 of the Civil Code, but never to be placed under tutelage. Affairs referred to by the law in 6, no. I, is not to be understood only as pecuniary affairs as the district court rightly assumed. The concept embraces the entirety of all circumstances of life, the ordered regulation of which is of interest to the law, protection of the person to be placed under tutelage, of his life and health, no less than the care of his relatives and his estate. Tutelage is primarily a protective measure. It is designed to assist him, who in consequence of being without insight is incapable of protecting himself, from being taken advantage of, and against exploitation by others. The state's duty to the patient extends as far as the patient's need of protection. But the precautionary measure of tutelage offered by law to the patient to save him in civil life from dangers arising out of his lack of willpower, must in fact be adequate and effective. Placing under tutelage is only permissible if such dangers to the person concerned are present which can be successfully countered by abjudication of his legal capacity I-104 of the Civil Code, and by appointing a guardian for the general care of his personal and pecuniary affairs I-1896. I compare memorandum to the draft of the Civil Code, p. 2. In this sense, is appellant in need of such protection, or is he capable of managing his affairs himself? The medical expert Dr. Weber gives no definite answer to this question in his two reports. He does not answer it with a direct yes or no. The decision is clearly difficult for him. Whereas in the usual clear-cut cases of mental illness he generally does not hesitate to draw the legal consequences from approved mental illness, p. 203b, himself for the sake of brevity, he declines to do so in the present case. He limits himself to delineating the picture of plaintiff's mental illness and to assembling the actual instances in which the patient's disturbed mental life presents itself conspicuously, leaving it to the judge to decide for himself from his reports whether plaintiff is to be considered capable of safeguarding his life interests in civil affairs. One cannot raise any objection to the medical expert's attitude. It is in fact not within the province of the medical expert to decide the practical legal aspect of the ascertained mental illness of a person, nor its influence on his legal capacity. To form an opinion on this question is solely the responsibility of the judge. Because the medical expert calls the illness which is manifest by plaintiff's delusions paranoia, one might be tempted to regard the question sub judice as thereby already decided. Thus Endman in his textbook, 31, p. 136, number 8, p. 137, 3rd edition, states simply that every person suffering from paranoia can be placed under tutelage. He is satisfied that the nature of this mental illness is in itself sufficient proof that the person suffering from it is incapable of weighing reasonably the consequences of his actions. This goes too far. As the medical expert Dr. Weber, an acknowledged authority in the science of psychiatry, correctly emphasizes, there are numerous paranoiacs who, despite severe mental derangement and although their thinking sometimes moves in the confines of the most absurd delusional ideas, are hardly recognized as sick by their environment, carry on their daily business correctly and in general fulfill the duties of their profession adequately. One might consider them peculiar, call them whimsical and think that they have fixed ideas, but as a rule one does not think of placing them under tutelage. The progress of recent legislation lies precisely in the fact that it is now possible to leave such more or less harmless persons in possession of their legal capacity of free disposition necessary to their progress in life, despite their ascertained mental derangement. Even though such persons are influenced by compulsive ideas which make them appear irresponsible in those fields of mental life directly affected, they have not altogether lost the faculty of acting reasonably. In those fields of mental activity removed from their delusional ideas or less exposed to them, they are mostly capable of carrying out their professional duties in a manner which gives rise to no objection. Compare Kraft-Ebing, Doubtful Mental States, p. 8, also Samter, in Großschatzbeiträgen, June 1901, p. 3. According to Orr. Weber's report, p. 206, to this group of illnesses belongs plaintiff's psychosis in the form it has taken in the last 4 years after the transition from the stage of acute insanity to the chronic illness. It is true plaintiff's way of looking at the world is falsified by the idea ruling him about his extraordinary position towards God, and Dr. Schreber suffers much from hallucinations. He acknowledges that the center of his life is his conviction that he is the continual object of the divine power of miracles. But only one single field of plaintiff's mental life is affected, the field of religion. What in our views is connected with divine matters and our belief about the relation of man to God, plaintiff will never be able to judge correctly, because he lacks insight into the pathological nature of his mode of thinking. But it does not necessarily follow that his judgment in all other fields of mental life must be equally pathologically altered. A person's religious feelings may have many and important points of contact with other fields of his mental life, nevertheless one cannot maintain that all these need be equally affected. The religious conviction which fills the believer and often enough is the center of life of the mentally healthy, does not enter into all aspects of life. Dr. Weber points out convincingly how a person can be in close scientific contact with another for a long time without gaining any idea of his religious convictions. These usually have no very close connection with his scientific views, both complexes of ideas leading up to a point a separate existence in his brain. The case of the paranoiac's delusional system is similar. According to the medical expert's statement, the prosecuting authority is therefore not correct when it holds against plaintiff, following Endemann's expositions, that because he is under the influence of delusional ideas his whole thinking therefore rests eo ipso on a false basis, and that in consequence all his acts of will must be pathologically influenced. As mental life is a unity, pathological fields of thought must of necessity spread to parts apparently healthy and little touched by the delusional system. It would appear that this notion of the unity of all psychic events is reflected in the scientific views of modern psychiatry. The medical expert Dr. Weber in his report also makes it his starting point, nevertheless its immediate importance is only theoretical. Opposite views used to be held, one unhesitatingly recognized partial insanity, and that this concept is still somewhat justified even today, is seen in Dr. Weber's report IP 205b. Whatever one's scientific or theoretical views about this question, the judge ordering tutelage has to consider the fact proved by experience, that the influence of delusional ideas ruling a paranoiac does not affect equally all fields of his ordinary civil life. Frequently there is present only a partial insanity, the pathological ideas withdraw to a certain circumscribed field and within these limits maintain a kind of separate existence, while other fields of life remain comparatively untouched and do not show any signs of mental derangement in the patient. IP 205. Certainly, one cannot deny the possibility of a partial disturbance spreading to a person's total mental function. This is a theoretical possibility in every form of mental abnormality. Dr. Weber perhaps wished to express this and nothing but this, when he declared in his first report IP 53, that it was unpredictable how at any given moment plaintiff might decide, should his legal capacity be restored, whether according to the dictates of his relatively healthy ideas or under the compulsion of the pathological belief in miracles which fills him. This alone, however, does not suffice for placing him under tutelage. As plaintiff rightly argues, one cannot deprive him of his legal capacity on the mere suspicion that his delusional ideas might lead him to unreasonable action in this or that field. According to law, it is necessary to establish positively that in consequence of mental illness he is incapable of managing his affairs. I6 of the Civil Code. The burden of proof lies with him who requests an order placing a person under tutelage. If proof cannot be furnished against plaintiff, and if official inquiries according to, into the mental state of the patient have also not led to any definite result, then the order of tutelage cannot be maintained. It is a debatable point what demands such proof should fulfill. One certainly cannot go as far as plaintiff, who wishes to allow a patient to be placed under tutelage only when the danger of his acting unreasonably is based on certainty. On the other hand, one must not be satisfied with mere doubts. The doubts must at least be tangible and have, through facts or otherwise, become probabilities. The showing of proof is therefore shifted to that field which alone can offer a conclusive answer to the question to be decided, namely the field of factual experiences. In order to place a person under tutelage, it must be ascertained to what extent a patient's delusions influence his accessions and omissions in social life. Is the person to be placed under tutelage still capable of meeting the demands of practical life despite his clouded mind, or are his senses so disturbed that his judgment for the reality of things and their sensible comprehension has been lost? This can only be decided with certainty on the basis of experience. The patient must actually have been exposed to the demands of life and have had to deal with affairs of legal consequence. Observations made on him in such circumstances would be the best test for establishing the correctness of his statement that though ill, he is nevertheless able of managing his affairs sensibly and in accordance with his interests like any other reasonable human being. The nature of his mental illness does not afford a reliable clue for the medical specialist. It only admits of suppositions. As already stated, the presence of paranoia does not exclude the continuance of complete legal capacity. In this opinion the court is in agreement with the medical expert. Even in his first report of November 28, 1900, Dr. Weber expressed regret that plaintiff had till then been rather restricted in acting independently in the ordering of his affairs outside the walls of the asylum, so that the matter had not been put to proper test. Po 451. He therefore limited himself mainly to giving a picture of the illness as it presented at the time to the eye of the expert observer. This situation has improved in the meantime. Since the first report, the patient has been permitted greater freedom of movement. He has been allowed contact with the most varied circles of the outside world. He has had the opportunity of showing, in dealing with his relatives and others, to what extent his delusional ideas rule his general thinking and feeling and to what extent they influence his relation to his fellow men. The Court of Appeal now has much more factual material for its judgment than the lower court had at the time. The observations which have been made in this matter are altogether favorable to plaintiff. One observation was forced on the judges of the Court of Appeal in their dealings with plaintiff during the proceedings. It was that Dr. Schreber's intellectual powers and the clarity of his thinking had in no way suffered by his illness. The way he personally took up the fight against the tutelage under which he was placed and how he carried it through according to plan, the acuity of the logical and juristical operations developed by him, the reasonableness with which he conducted himself, and last but not least the refined measured attitude he showed when in opposition to the medical expert and the prosecutor, all this affords indisputable proof that in this field plaintiff has no need of protection by a guardian. Rather, in conducting his case he was able to preserve his interests to the full and independently, better indeed than anybody else could have done it in his place. Too great a weight must, however, not be placed on this side of plaintiff's mental life. The capacity to think logically and correctly appears, as Dr. Weber remarks, POSAB, well developed in paranoia CS. It is not an infallible sign of the patient's equal capacity to judge correctly matters of life that lie outside pure thinking. In this sphere the complementary experiences are important which the medical expert Dr. Weber has had the opportunity of collecting about the patient's behavior in his relation to the outside world during the last 18 months, and on which he reported in his second report of April 5, 1902. In his first report Dr. Weber, despite little opportunity of collecting observations on Dr. Schreber's social behavior, had to acknowledge that the pathological sphere of his mind was already fairly sharply demarcated from the rest, and had to add that plaintiff's judgment in matters and affairs far removed from his firmly established delusional system was usually correct, pages 47, Sob. In his second report he repeated this with great emphasis. The picture of the illness itself has not changed. In the main it is the same as when he was placed under tutelage. Only more material based on observation is available, giving the medical expert the opportunity of supplementing his previous opinion which was based on fairly limited factual material and where necessary of correcting it. There can therefore be no hesitation in applying the results reached by the medical expert only in his later report, and using them in retrospect directly for judging plaintiff's mental state at the time when he was placed under tutelage. Dr. Weber is now convinced that plaintiff's delusional ideas lead a relatively separate existence in his mental life and that outside the religious field which they mainly dominate they affect other fields particularly of daily life hardly at all, and that hallucinations from which plaintiff continues to suffer, do not now influence his feeling and thinking to any significant degree. Such pathological manifestations as do appear are noticeable outwardly mostly in comparatively unimportant fields only. Especially the more important life interests have withdrawn from their domination and are appreciated in a manner beyond reproach, pages 208a/b, 211b, 212b. In order to furnish further grounds for his opinion, the medical expert mentions a number of actual events in part observed by himself, in part reported to him by reliable observers. All these have also strengthened the appeal court in its conviction that the danger of plaintiff's wrong and inappropriate action in affairs of legal consequence appears almost nil, in any case not so imminent as to justify the upholding of his tutelage. For a few years appellant has eaten daily as a guest at the family table of the director of the asylum without causing any annoyance to the others present. On the contrary, Dr. Weber, who looks upon his relation to plaintiff as a friendly one, extols the patient's delicate tact and forbearance which prevented him from molesting the company at table with his miraculous ideas. P. Sob. Dr. Schreber believes he can be certain that other persons at table, particularly the ladies, have never noticed even a trace of his mental illness. In view of Dr. Weber's statements about patient's conduct, one can give the latter credence. The appellant's movements outside the asylum also have not given rise to any trouble worth mentioning. While Dr. Schreber until the summer of 1900 was only allowed outside the asylum accompanied by an attendant, he has since then been allowed unlimited freedom of movement unaccompanied outside the asylum. He has used it to make almost daily excursions on foot, by ship or railway, to visit all noteworthy parts of the environment of Perna, partly alone, partly in company, and also at times to frequent concerts, theaters, public performances, etc. He has repeatedly been to Dresden to keep appointments at court, to visit his wife or do some shopping, and lately at the invitation of his relatives and with the agreement of the asylum authorities he even undertook a journey to Leipzig on his own, from which he returned after a week's absence and which according to his sister's report went off quite well. Dr. Weber confirms that plaintiff never carried out any unreasonable or incorrect action, always discussed openly and without keeping anything back those of his plans and intentions which fell outside his normal daily activities, and before carrying them through made sure he had the sanction of the asylum authorities. When carrying them out he always acted cautiously and sensibly, taking into consideration all the circumstances. Dr. Weber thinks he is equally justified in believing that no great annoyances were ever caused by plaintiff in his contact with the outside world. P. 290A/B. With the 50 marks a month pocket money which plaintiff has received for about a year to meet the expenses of his excursions and smaller necessaries, he has dealt in an orderly fashion and in the manner of a careful head of a family. It never came to notice that he squandered the money and therefore ran short. Neither did one have the impression of particular parsimony. Rather one noticed that he considered every expenditure well beforehand, avoided expensive things, and did not buy anything useless, apart from the small feminine trinkets. In short, in the whole of plaintiff's behavior during his contact with the world outside the asylum, there has until now not been a single fact which could give well-founded grounds for anxiety, that the patient would allow himself to be led astray under the compulsion of his delusional system, or impair his legal interests through wrong actions if freedom of action were restored to him. Practical experience has shown that plaintiff's insane belief in miracles, although forming the basis of his mental life, does not dominate him so exclusively that he is deprived of the capacity of quiet and sensible consideration of other affairs of life. It is a fact, then, that no important legal interest would be jeopardized were plaintiff to have full legal capacity restored to him. It is impossible that plaintiff would endanger his life, just as little as he is a danger to the lives of others. His tutelage cannot therefore be upheld as a necessary precaution to protect the patient's environment. It is admitted that disturbances are caused by the bellowing attacks which at times plague plaintiff and which could be very molesting to his environment, although he states that outside the asylum he is almost completely free of them. In any case, the so-called automatic and compulsive vociferations occurring against the patients will have no bearing on the question of his tutelage. They might necessitate police intervention should the peace of the neighborhood be disturbed, but they cannot justify maintaining his tutelage, especially as tutelage is not an effectual measure against them. Also irrelevant is the prosecutor's statement that during the bellowing attacks and at those moments when the patient's thoughts are deflected by hallucinations, his freedom of will appears completely suspended. This may be so. but no immediate danger would thereby arise for plaintiff. It is obviously a matter of rapidly passing disturbances of consciousness lasting a few moments, during which transactions of legal consequence are in any case precluded. There is also no danger to plaintiff's health according to Dr. Weber's report. In general, he knows well how to look after himself and is careful not to damage himself by willful actions, p. 211. In this respect also there is no need for protection by a guardian. It is true the medical expert mentions in his second report of April 5, 1902 one episode, when under the influence of his mental disturbance, plaintiff is said to have acted inappropriately in respect of the treatment of a short illness, diarrhea and vomiting. He places little importance on this episode, and agrees retrospectively with plaintiff's remonstrance that the latter finally did acquiesce in the measures ordered by the doctors, p. 231 AFB. It is certainly not correct to say that plaintiff, because of his belief in miracles, despises medicines in general. Plaintiff appropriately points to his having in earlier years almost daily and of his own free will taken artificial sleeping drugs, pages 226, 231b. Even if it were the case, placing him under tutelage would not remedy it. The patient's dislike of doctor and pharmacy, which actually does not exist, would neither be conquered by recognizing his legal capacity nor by placing him under tutelage. It would give rise to more serious concern, if plaintiff's illness required for its improvement a prolonged stay in the asylum, and his mental derangement prevented him from realizing this, and if he were fighting for his tutelage to be rescinded only to enforce his discharge from the asylum after being freed from the surveillance of a guardian. According to official information which the asylum authorities of Sonnenstein only recently gave plaintiff in answer to his question of May 29 of this year, pages 252/253, there is now no need for apprehension. Dr. Weber agrees in principle with plaintiff's discharge from the asylum, with certain self-explanatory precautions. He expressly declares that he does not consider the patient dangerous to himself or others, and furthermore has no hesitation in returning plaintiff to free congress with human society. This negatives the need for the care of a guardian with respect to the patient's health. Should the judge nevertheless wish to affirm the necessity of tutelage from this point of view, he would thereby place himself in opposition to the authoritative judgment of the medical expert and of the asylum authorities. There is also no need to fear that the patient might endanger his monetary affairs through wrong and unreasonable actions. As the medical expert states, or Schreber is fully informed about the state of his finances. The trial in latter years of letting him act financially on his own by giving him pocket money has worked out very well. Plaintiff has shown himself in every way careful and economical. There is no reason to think he would squander his fortune, if unrestricted power over it were restored to him. Dr. Weber, who knows plaintiff best and is most able to judge the influence of his delusional ideas, in any case gives the assurance that he has no reason to think that through pathological motives he would exceed the limits of his resources and squander his fortune, p. 211. The apprehension expressed by the lower court that plaintiff might be induced to offer awards for scientific investigation under the compulsion of his wondrous ideas and in order to make propaganda for them, was from the outset not very serious. One has never noticed a tendency in plaintiff to spend money for the sake of his belief in miracles. The Court of Appeal has therefore no reason to mistrust plaintiff, particularly as the medical expert concurs in this opinion, when the former affirms he does not intend making sacrifices for the advancement of his belief in miracles and that it never entered his head to spend one penny for this purpose. Of course, one cannot exclude the possibility that plaintiff, despite his assurances, might at a given moment unconsciously be influenced in his financial dispositions by the fantastic ideas which dominate him. The possibility of such an influence exists in every mental abnormality, even if it has not assumed the form of established insanity. It is, however, a matter of consideration for law and legal order only when such a possibility has become a real danger. There is nothing like that in this case. Only in one single instance has a direct influence of plaintiff's religious delusions on the disposition of his fortune been proved. To this Dr. Schreber himself drew attention. It concerns his attraction to all kinds of small ornaments with which, like a woman, he occasionally decorates his breast, which he believes is changing into a woman's bosom. To spend money on such nonsensical stuff would never occur to him if he were mentally completely normal. But it is a matter of such insignificant sums that they could not play any part in the difficult decision as to whether or not he is legally capable of managing his affairs. Even if one totally disregarded the patient's statements that these decorations are a kind of mental medication which help to calm his attacks of nervous excitation, one could at worst only consider them a whim. Besides, much larger sums of money are spent on such whims by otherwise healthy people. It is beyond dispute that plaintiff is completely capable of using his reasoning faculties to administer his and his wife's finances. These are not so intricate as the prosecutor maintains, even regarding the individual items which, according to the inventory on P175FF of the Judicial Guardian's files, make up the fortune of the married couple Schreber. Plaintiff has only recently brought clear proof of his competence in this direction, in that he dealt with the extraordinarily difficult question of making further use of his father's book Medical Indoor Gymnastics after its publisher had gone into liquidation. He showed such acuity, clarity, and circumspection in a report which he wrote at the request of his family, that they had no scruples whatever in following his suggestions. This is according to trustworthy information from his brother-in-law Jung, the merchant in Leipzig, pages 41-43 of the file of the tutelage proceedings. This circumstance not only proves Dr. Schreber's technical ability of managing such matters, but proves at the same time that he does not lack inclination or interest to devote to the affairs of his fortune the necessary business-like attention. It is said Dr. Schreber's relationship to his family is threatened, the marital bond with his wife in danger of being destroyed. This also cannot be conceded. As plaintiff rightly stresses, marital union with his wife has been almost completely in abeyance for years owing to his mental illness and the necessity created by it of living apart from her. How then could this relationship be worsened if freedom to decide over his person were now returned to plaintiff? Dr. Schreber has the sincere wish to resume domestic union with his wife and to live in the seclusion of a quiet country seat for the rest of his days, as soon as his discharge from the asylum is granted. He therefore strives on his part to improve existing marital relations. Whether this can be achieved in reality is of course a different matter. The miraculous ideas which dominate plaintiff's mental life and which probably will become a much greater nuisance to his wife in intimate contact with him than to outsiders further removed, make it a pair doubtful whether the married couples living together will work in the long run. One would have to try and see. But however this may work out has no influence on the decision whether his tutelage is to be upheld. Even on this point one must agree with plaintiff that consideration of other persons' well-being, even of nearest relatives, cannot be taken into account. Placing under tutelage is primarily for the well-being of the person concerned. It is inadmissible in the interest of others. Compare 2 of the Ministry of Justice's regulations for placing a person under tutelage because of mental illness, etc., December 23, 1899. Moreover, Dr. Schreber is well aware, as can be seen from his statements in the proceedings, of the moral duties which he owes to his wife in these difficult circumstances. His mind is not disturbed to such an extent as to make him blind to the degree of self-denial which may be demanded of his wife when living together with him. He will make no unfair demands on her if life together is impossible, also he would grant her everything to which she is legally entitled. He rejects altogether the suggestion that he might neglect his legal duties as regards her maintenance, or that he would dispose of his fortune to her disadvantage out of resentment towards her. He states that in any case a joint will of the year 1886 exists which precludes such dispositions. Further, however careful one must be in trusting the assurances of mentally ill persons, plaintiff's great moral seriousness and candor of character, not lessened by illness, also stressed by Dr. Weber and evidenced in all his declarations in court, disperse all doubt in their trustworthiness. Thus the medical experts earlier remarked that Dr. Schreber in his relation to his wife is quick to speak of divorce, if she does not willingly agree with his delusions, loses in importance. Apparently this report is based on Dr. Schreber's wife's statements and rests on misunderstandings. Plaintiff has clarified this matter in statements which make his behavior towards his wife free from any objection. These explanations are not contradicted in Dr. Weber's second report after he had seen them. It only remains that plaintiff might compromise himself and his family by his intended publication of the memoirs and even place himself in conflict with the criminal law. No reasonable person would wish to deny serious scruples about publishing the manuscript. Not even Dr. Schreber could ignore them. If nevertheless he urgently insists on publication, this is not proof of his deficient capacity of anticipating the results of his actions, but only proof of the strength of his belief in the truth of the revelations which have been granted him by God. I cannot wish, he remarks in his own words, that the knowledge of God which has been revealed to me should sink into oblivion with my death, and an opportunity be lost to mankind of achieving more correct ideas about the beyond which might never occur again. The appellant knows that this might have unpleasant consequences for him. But he is justified in denying the accusation of the lower court that he had written anything in the memoirs damaging to the honor of his family. It is a fact that nothing of the kind can be found in the manuscript. One also cannot maintain that the contents of the memoirs are such as to compromise plaintiff himself. The manuscript is the product of a morbid imagination, and nobody reading it would for a moment lose the feeling that its author is mentally deranged. But this could not possibly lower the patient in the respect of his fellow men, particularly as no one can miss the seriousness of purpose and striving after truth which fill every chapter. As Dr. Schreber remarks correctly, the worst that could happen to him would be that one consider him mad, and this one does in any case. One cannot be offended by the strong language in the book. It is not plaintiff's, he only repeats what the voices of spirits spoke into him in earlier years when he was most severely hallucinated. This must be kept in mind when one tries to find the correct standard for judging the defamation which Professor Flechsig suffers in the memoirs, as he is accused of soul murder and worse. Even here plaintiff is not in any way talking for himself or acting on his own behalf, but only reporting what the voices of miraculous spirits told him, with whom in his opinion he was in communication. He certainly had no intention of attacking Professor Flechsig nor of wittingly insulting his honor while writing the memoirs. The danger of being sued by Flechsig for libel is not very great, particularly as certain alterations are to be made in the manuscript before it is printed. Punishment appears in any case out of the question because plaintiff is protected in all eventualities by 5I of the Criminal Code. Even should plaintiff expose himself to the risk of criminal conviction by it, this would not suffice as a reason for denying his legal capacity. Placing under tutelage cannot be used as a means of preventing a person with a mental defect but otherwise capable of managing his affairs, from undertaking one single wrong action or to save him from the possible adverse effects of such an action. The same applies to the prosecutor's view of the disadvantages of the contract which plaintiff would be forced to conclude with the publishers of the memoirs. Firstly, it is by no means certain that the conclusion of the contract with the publisher on a commission basis must involve financial loss for plaintiff, though it is probable enough. But one must remember that the business risk which plaintiff runs is really not very considerable in comparison with the rest of his fortune. To save him from such a risk is not the task of tutelage. Plaintiff knows full well that the publication of the memoirs could become a financial burden. In this matter also he does not require legal protection such as tutelage would afford him. The Court of Appeal has therefore arrived at the conviction that plaintiff is capable of dealing with the demands of life in all its spheres here discussed. These are the most important ones, the orderly regulation of which is the object of the law. There is no evidence and it cannot be regarded as ascertained that he is incapable of managing his affairs owing to his delusional ideas. Therefore, in considering the appeal which has been lodged, this must lead to the tutelage inflicted on plaintiff being rescinded without entering into new evidence by witnesses offered by him. I 672 CPO. The decision on costs rests on 673 CPO. Signed, Hardrod, Vogel, or Steinmetz, Nikolai, Dr. Paul. Dresden, July 26, 1902. Il.S. Heinker, Clerk to the Royal Superior Country Court of Saxony. No notice of appeal has been received at the Imperial German High Court in the above action within the required period ended on September 1, 1902. Leipzig, September 3, 1902. Il.S. Skubitz, Secretariat 6 of the Imperial German High Court. The above judgment became valid on IST September 1902 as hereby witnessed. Dresden, 17th September 1902. Il.S. Miller, Clerk to the Royal Superior Country Court of Saxony.